My feudal lord. Tehmina Durrani. There is a fantasy of a feudal lord as an exotic, tall, dark and handsome man, with flashing eyes and traces of quick-tempered gypsy blood, images of him parrying thrusts with the fiercest of swordsmen and riding off into the sunset on his black steed set the pubescent heart aflutter. He is seen as a passionate ladies' man and something of a rough diamond, the archetypal male chauvinist who forces a woman to love him despite his treatment of her. But the fantasy is far from reality, and my country of Pakistan must face up to reality if it is ever to grow and prosper. When I decided to write this book, I was aware of the perils of exposing the details of my private life to a male-dominated Muslim society. But I had to cast aside my personal considerations in favor of the greater good. There is a deep-rooted deficiency in the feudal value system. It must be diagnosed before it is treated. Education. I dedicate this book to the people of Pakistan, who have repeatedly trusted and supported their leaders who have, in return, used the hungry, oppressed, miserable multitudes to further their personal interests. I want the people of my country to know the truth behind the rhetoric, so that they might learn to look beyond the facade. To the 5 other ex-wives of Mustafa Khar, who have silently suffered pain and dishonor while he walked away with impunity. As his 6th wife, I am holding him accountable. To Mustafa Khar himself. I wish that this book might serve as a mirror, so that he may see in it reflections of the man, the husband, the father, the leader and the friend he is. To my beloved children, who, in our closed society, shall have to suffer the trials of a family exposed. I trust that this book will help them muster strength and courage to face continuing trauma. I want them to reject wrong and endorse right. I hope and pray that their values may be based on true Islamic principles, rather than a distorted, self-serving interpretation. May their love and respect for their motherland cause them to reject any compromise. May my sons never oppress the weak. May my daughters learn to fight oppression. Finally, to my grandmother. None could have understood my story better. May our soul, wherever it may be, know that I survived. Acknowledgements. For special people helped me through the nearly impossible task of writing this book. They understood the risks of speaking out, of breaking the taboos of a dosed society, yet bravely saw the project through. One remarkable man and 2 women have encouraged and helped me relive the traumas of the past. A 4th person, under similar restrictions of security, typed the manuscript. I cannot take the responsibility of naming them, but I am indebted to them all. I offer special appreciation to Bernard Fixit and Antoine Auduit for carrying the story to the world. Part 1 Lion of the Punjab. 1. My pale green chiffon sari rustled softly as I moved, and my braided plait of auburn hair fell all the way to my knees. Around my neck a row of diamonds matched my earrings. As I checked my appearance in a full-length mirror, my face flushed with self-conscious pleasure. It was spring 1974, in Lahore, the 2nd largest city of Pakistan. The reception was being held in the main hall of the Punjab Club. Summoned by the Honorary Consul of Spain, Lahore's beautiful people were celebrating Spain's National Day. My uncle had invited my husband Ains and me to accompany him. Having arrived in Lahore only the week before, it was our first opportunity to meet the city's elite. Ains felt flattered and pleased to be included. He was only a junior executive in the state-owned National Shipping Corporation. These were people he felt he should know. As for me, could any sense of foreboding have told me that I was about to have the most crucial meeting of my life? Ains wandered off on his own, making contacts, and I was suddenly alone, a 21-year-old woman feeling very self-conscious among this older crowd, who seemed so self-assured. Around me, in the spacious halls and shaded patios of the Punjab Club, I could sense the atmosphere of the British Raj that had ended 27 years earlier with independence and the splitting up of British India into two separate states. This was Pakistan, my country. Beyond the border crossing just outside Lahore lay India, our overpowering neighbor. Sharing, to a large extent, a common heritage of culture, language, and family ties, the two countries are locked in a fateful, and at times bloody, relationship of love-hate. I found a seat and took a glass offered by a bearer, as waiters are called here. They are trained to attend a mere wink to the needs of the former colonial and now indigenous members of this distinguished club. With their long white coats, buttoned all the way down over baggy trousers, their stiffly starched turbans arranged in peacock shapes, they were figures from our imperial past. Looking around, I exchanged a formal smile with my neighbor. She made an effort to talk, and I was pleased to realize that I had a friend for the evening. Her name was Dr. Shahida Amjad. She was a physician and well-versed in the game of who's who. I told her that I was new to Lahore, and feeling rather lost. Too well-mannered to point, she gestured with her eyes towards various people in the crowd as she delivered quiet potted biographies. Lahore proudly calls itself the cultural capital of Pakistan. 20 years ago it could still live up to this reputation with splendor. At its heart, the centuries-old walled city, with its overflowing bazaars and its splendid though dilapidated family mansions, broad canals lined by old trees, and shady avenues were not yet polluted by an ever-increasing flow of traffic. Formal gardens created by Mughal emperors centuries ago had become public parks, but were not yet crowded at all hours with thousands of visitors. Along the mall, the city's main avenue, lay the stately buildings from its colonial past: the Governor's House, Aitchison College, the High Court, the Punjab Club. This was where the well-mannered and highly educated members of Lahore's elite had congregated this evening. The gentlemen were wearing Western suits or the traditional akans, buttoned coats in black or white, made of silk or the finest wool. Alcoholic drinks such as whiskey and soda and gin and tonic were freely offered and accepted. Nowadays they have been banned as sinful signs of Western decadence. Politely chattering, in separate, but segregated, groups, the ladies were most elegantly draped in saris, each requiring a 6-meter length of colorful, and often gold-embroidered silk or chiffon. Today, these graceful garments have become quite rare, discarded as being Indian. With Shahida talking on, my gaze settled upon a tall, dark and handsome man in a black suit. His starched white shirt was set off by a burgundy tie and a matching handkerchief. My mind classified him as a rake, a bit devilish in an appealing sort of way. He had attracted a group of women around him, who seemed to hang on his every word. But the buzz of gentle conversation, the tinkle of ice cubes and well-manicured laughter made it impossible for me to hear. I asked my new friend who he was. Him? You mean you don't know who he is? Shahida sounded surprised. My face must have registered curiosity because she quickly explained, that is Mustafa Khar. The two words were spoken as one, Mustafa Khar. Oh, I replied. The ash on his Davidoff cigar was about to flake and fall on the expensive carpet, but he did not seem to care. Slowly and stylishly, he raised a glass of scotch to his mouth. Instead of taking a drink, he merely touched the vessel to his lips below his well-groomed moustache. His eyes glittered, like those of a cobra ready to strike. He obviously relished his ability to mesmerize this elite female company. An attractive young woman in an orange chiffon sari glided past us. She, too, carried herself with an important, self-confident air. I asked Shahida who she was. That's Shahrazad, my friend replied. Sherry. Mustafa Khar's wife. Oh. I thought, Mustafa Khar's wife is very beautiful. I asked Shahida to tell me more about this man, and I learned that he had just resigned as Chief Minister of the Punjab. This told me a great deal. The Punjab is the largest province of the country, ruled more or less the whims of the feudal lords who controlled vast landholdings and whose vassals voted as instructed. The Punjab wielded great political power in the federal government, therefore, its chief minister would be a man of consequence. Shahida said that this Mustafa Khar was extremely popular here, having earned the nickname Lion of the Punjab, and some said that he had been the second most powerful politician in the whole of Pakistan, second only to Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. But that situation had changed. He had annoyed Bhutto, his mentor, by becoming an obvious threat. Mustafa Khar was committed to a political platform that offered reform for the myriad of social problems that beset the common millions of the Punjab, who lived their lives in poverty and illiteracy. In the history of Pakistan politics, it had always been necessary for the national leader to quash the leader of the Punjab, lest the sheer number of his supporters assure his superiority. Shahida knew that my curiosity was piqued. "Come," she suggested, "I'll introduce you to Sherry. You'll like her." We made our way through the rich throng. Shahida presented me to Sherry, and our conversation turned naturally toward our families. When Sherry learned that my father was Tehmina Durrani, she jokingly asked if I would like to meet her husband. I would. Mustafa Khar had been Bhutto's right-hand man when Bhutto had sent my father to prison. I told Sherry that I hated Bhutto this injustice, but certainly held no resentment towards her husband. Within moments Sherry was introducing me to the lion himself, mentioning my father. "I hope your parents are well," Mustafa said graciously. "Politics can be unfair. There was nothing personal in what happened to your father. Where are they now?" "They're doing well," I said. I detailed how, after he was freed from prison and exonerated, father had taken a banking job in New York City, and had, a year later, accepted another banking post in London. My parents, younger brother, and 3 younger sisters lived there now. An older sister was married. Ains suddenly appeared at my side, and he too was introduced. Ains indicated to me that he had apparently made a favorable impression upon our host, who had extended an invitation for us to remain for dinner. My feudal lord, Tehmina Durrani, copyright symbol www.sonopionwar.com 4. Mustafa Khar was the kind of man who could choose his place at the dinner table, and he chose to sit directly across from me. We made small talk across the salt cellars. He asked about my parents again, how they were, where they were, what they were doing. His words did not hold me, but his eyes had me riveted. They grew lustrous, they glittered and blinked rather frequently, they peered across the table at me hypnotically. Their message was far from subtle. Perhaps I should have been frightened, instead I was drawn like a moth to a flame. After dinner, we adjourned to a sitting room for cognac and liqueurs. The men smoked, and so did some of the women. Mustafa was clearly the chief of this group, and all the rest of us were merely rank and file. As he drained the last of his Napoleon brandy, 3 men moved at once to replenish it. He rolled his cigar in practiced fingers, and, the very moment he lifted it toward his lips, the cigar cutter appeared. When it was snipped and ready, 6 lighters flicked open. Mustafa took this deference in his stride. I drank it in. I was the perfect victim. A painting hangs on the wall of my home in Lahore, depicting a breathtakingly beautiful woman draped in an emerald green sari. Every feature is exquisite, as if an artist hallucinated and then painted an imaginary ideal. Her translucent, ivory complexion is complemented by enormous almond-shaped brown eyes with heavy lids and long lashes. She has a tiny waist even after 6 children, and her face remains soft and innocent, masking her dominant personality. Yet the painting do not do full justice to the subject. I should know, for she is my mother, Samina. She came from the Hayat family of the Kotor tribe which had settled in Wa, on the northern edge of the Punjab near the border with the northwest frontier province. As a result of loyal service to the crown, British colonial masters had given vast tracts of lands to the family. The Hayats had fought alongside the Moors in Spain, and claimed that the family's renowned good looks were the result of intermarriages with Spanish women. My mother's Anglicized family had been actively involved in the politics of the princely states that were scattered throughout India prior to independence. Before partition, her father, Nawab Sir Liaquat Haya Khan, had been Prime Minister of Peshawar state, and her uncle, Sir Sikandar Hayat Khan, governor of the undivided Punjab. Both her brothers had been knighted. In my mother's childhood home, the British way of life was slavishly aped. The Hayat men pursued the pastimes of the idle rich. They strove for sartorial. My feudal lord, Tehmina Durrani, copyright symbol www.sonopionwar.com 5. Elegants with their classic, tailored clothes, played polo, learned all the latest dances, went on shikar, hunting expeditions, and threw lavish parties. The beautiful women of the family, who wore exotic Eastern dress, nevertheless spoke and behaved in an Anglicized way and were thus considered, by the natives, to be advanced or fast. They had come out of the veil. Only over time would I come to understand what a shock I was to my mother. She was a light-skinned beauty, and proud of it. Her family was fair-skinned and considered itself to be superior by that fact. A dark child was condemned to neglect. And yet there I was, arriving in the world in 1953 with a dark skin. It seemed evident by my mother's attitude that she regarded me as ugly and was embarrassed to present me to friends and relatives. Even as a baby I felt my inadequacy. My surroundings seemed hostile to the way I looked, and very early I withdrew into an isolated, condemned by nature, cell. I never remember my mother hugging or kissing me when I was little. Regardless of my growing, deep-rooted, internal complexes, my childhood must have appeared extremely comfortable to an outsider. Our home was impeccable and always orderly, as though waiting to be photographed. We were a model family, the sort of offspring who are pointed out as examples of decorum to other, naughtier, children. We were lavished with comforts and privileges and traveled the world. My father is a Pathan, descended from the family of Ahmed Shah Durrani of Afghanistan. He had met my mother after her divorce from the Nawab of Tank's eldest son. He was a captain in the army, an aide to the governor of West Pakistan at the time they met. After he left the army, during Field Marshal Ayub's presidency, he had initiated and developed the first investment corporation of Pakistan, ICP. Then, in 1967, he was appointed managing director of PAA, our national airline. Later, when General Yahya Khan declared martial law and became president, my father was appointed governor of the State Bank of Pakistan. I loved my father. 6 foot tall, he had the presence of a film star. He was as handsome as my mother was beautiful. They made a very glamorous couple, though my mother was the dominant partner and seemed to have the final say in everything. To me he was a rather distant figure. He controlled his affection. Whenever he had the chance he would tell me he loved me most of his children, but chances were rare. I never really understood why he could not show his love or express it. I believe now that my mother did not approve of him displaying any affection towards me, because I was his eldest child and she felt insecure about Rubina, my half-sister, through her first marriage. My father would return home from work each day cheerful and full of life. In fact, to a small daughter he was larger than life in his conservative suits and pinstripe shirts. But despite the important offices he held, the instant he entered our home he seemed to wilt. His demeanor turned serious as he reported the details of his day to mother in clipped, crisp English, as if looking for approval. If he ventured a joke, her lips tightened. Father had to live by my mother's rules. He interfered with nothing in the house. My mother took all the decisions regarding our home. In our social circle in the giant metropolis of Karachi, in the southern tip of Pakistan, Mother was renowned for her fashionable soirees, which featured recitations from poets and readings from other intellectuals. She was very shrewd in anticipating who was about to become in. The guests were gleaned from Pakistan's version of the social register. As children, of course, we did not participate in these events, except as a homegrown set of helpers, along with the retinue of servants. We learned how to lay the silver cutlery for a formal dinner party. We were told how to serve a 5-course meal using the appropriate Rosenthal or Wedgwood crockery. We knew the proper way to sprinkle rose petals into the lukewarm water of a finger bowl, and never to forget the lemon. We knew how to arrange the individual salt and pepper shakers and assortment of condiments. My mother demanded total obedience and, although I always complied, she discerned early signs of rebellion in both my expression and my body language. I obeyed, but my crime was that I did not look obedient. I was sullen, and she resented my resentment. We never spoke openly about this, however. Her disapproval was communicated through pursed lips and a deep, icy stare that crumbled me, or anyone, into instant submission. When my mother spoke, it was a command, and we were to carry out orders in silence. We rarely ate with our parents in the evening, either they were going out to dinner or entertaining, and we were not included. But lunchtimes, when my father was sway at his office, were occasions for another command performance. Mother, immaculately groomed and perfectly dressed, lectured from the head of the table with tough-spoken formality. When she grew silent, the meal became a muted symphony of silver cutlery tinkling against fine bone china. The tempo was set by the ticking of the grandfather clock. There was no play and very little laughter in the household, and a childhood burst of enthusiasm was frowned upon. Untidiness was a crime. Mother accomplished her objectives without ever raising a hand to us. When we did misbehave, we were subjected to a stern lecture which we could neither react to nor counter. She was masterly at playing one of us against another, and we all became tiny spies. I can find everything out, she boasted. She never read Machiavelli's The Prince, but she crafted a careful divide-and-conquer strategy that kept us all off balance. The lesson was clear, and I learned it well. Blind acquiescence was necessary to gain approval. Being yourself earned only condemnation. I was acceptable only when I was unlike myself, whoever that was, because I wore a mask of submission. I developed a personality that was against my true nature, but compatible with Mother's. Inwardly I became confused and sometimes ashamed that what I must really be was incorrect and unacceptable. Mother was not subtle in playing favorites. Almost every word and action indicated her preference for her white-skinned children, her son Asim and her daughters Manu, and especially the baby Adila Rubma, Zarmina, and I, the darker daughters, never seemed able to please her. This was especially difficult to comprehend in the case Zarmina, who was the sweetest, most considerate and lovable child one could imagine. My maternal grandmother Shamshad was well aware of the stigma that a dark complexion assured. She had blatantly favored my mother over her darker sister Sama. Yet my grandmother loved Zarmina and me so much that she constantly sought to rid us of the dark curse. Cucumber juice, lemons, fresh cream and a pungent-smelling bleaching agent called Lamex were rubbed into our mud-colored faces. As we grew older, nature bestowed the benefit, necessary if one is to be acceptable to the Hoyot family, of lightening the pigment of our skins. It was as if I shed the chrysalis of my dark skin and emerged as a socially acceptable butterfly. Sometimes I wondered whether my grandmother had been able to work the transformation through her potions, or her prayers. But Mother did not notice, or if she did, the development did not affect her attitude. Our elder half-sister Rubina was placed in charge of the younger 3 girls, as a training exercise in preparation for her own marriage and motherhood. At the age of 12, I was given the position of wardrobe mistress. I was expected to maintain my mother's bedroom, and to make sure that her lavish wardrobe was always in order. Despite our modern lifestyle, Mother disdained the Western manner of dressing and demanded that our entire family conform to Eastern fashion. Each day before school, I laid out the appropriate outfit for my mother's morning, complete with the correct shoes and accessories. She favored cotton saris or delicate drapes of chiffon across her bosom. I had to select the jeweler with care from her exquisite and expensive collection, so that it did not clash with her ensemble. Once her toilette was completed, I was free to leave for school. After school, we repeated the ritual for our dinner outfit. Mother never retrieved anything from cupboards or dressers. She simply put out her hand, and I was to have the necessary item ready, leaving her concentration free to attend to braiding her long hair, rimming her eyes with kohl and brushing her cheeks with color. I stood in silence behind her. When she finally left her bedroom for the evening, I would sigh with relief and lay out her nightclothes on the bed, place her slippers exactly where she expected them to be, and tidy up the bath and dressing rooms. The servant would turn the sheets over and switch on the bedside lamps, place the water jug and glasses, and draw up the curtains. My Feudal Lord, Tehmina Durrani, copyright symbol www.sonopionwar.com 8. The muscles in my neck and shoulders still relive the tension created by the ever-present fear that I would misplace something or be unable to locate the keys to her armoire or jeweler box. To do so would render me inadequate in her eyes and create such wrath that I became obsessed with the seemingly simple task. Panic would overtake me and the location of the keys took precedence in my mind over everything else. Schoolwork and other responsibilities paled in comparison. All the maternal love I remember came from my mother's mother. She pampered me so much that we ended up squabbling. Because I was so skinny, she constantly tried to force-feed me. Her emphasis on my appearance brought out the worst reactions in me. "Parents like pretty children," she would say. "Your mother will love you more if you are looking nice." Waving her hands in despair at my rejection of her plans for my beautification, she would suggest, "Put your hair over your ears. It looks nicer." Or, "Put some kajal, kohl, over your eyes, they stand out more." Poor grandmother never realized how deeply the complex of being ugly was setting in, how much it would affect Ivy life. Grandmother had another paranoia, because I loved to paint. She was convinced that artists are usually eccentric and end up becoming mad. She would hide my paints, so that I would avoid indulging in what might take me further into a mad world. At the age of 13 I was stricken with meningitis, which, it was whispered, grandmother and my father attributed to the strain brought on by the chore of caring for mother's wardrobe. I was not expected to survive. Doctors ventured the opinion that if I did pull through, I might suffer paralysis or brain damage. My father hired round-the-clock nurses and converted our guest room into a hospital ward. For 6 months a strange aura of life and death pervaded the household. Even after my survival was assured, my parents considered me sickly and somewhat unstable. It was during this time that my baby sister Adila was born. Apart from my father, brother, and a few close relatives, men were alien creatures, and from my earliest moments I was trained to avoid them. My childhood was encumbered by a lengthy list of don'ts, all designed to maintain an inviolate distance between myself and the masculine world. Never wear makeup or nail polish. Do not look at boys. Avoid modern girlfriends and avoid any girl who has an older brother. Never visit a friend without special permission and without your nanny. Never pick up the telephone. Never go out alone with the driver. Never stand around in the kitchen with the male servants. And yet, clearly, a man was the only future available to a Pakistani girl. My role in life was to marry and to marry well. Mother had an ideal man in mind for each of us. Our husbands were to be the only males to whom we would ever be exposed. Not surprisingly, they would exhibit a combination of Eastern and Western traits. They would come from good and noble families and be well educated, preferably at Oxford or Cambridge. Our marriages were supposed to add to our parents' social standing. Personal happiness would be an added bonus. To ensure that we kept no secrets from her and that she knew our every move. Mother had us convinced that she would not oppose anyone whom we wished to marry, as long as we informed her immediately of our intention. Despite the fact that our mother had divorced her first husband, we were taught that marriage was a sacred and irrevocable institution. If a husband turned out to be a brute, it was the wife's duty to persevere until she changed his character. A broken marriage was a reflection of a woman's failure. My mother had been married by arrangement when she was only 15 years old to the Nawab of Tank's eldest son and heir, Mustafa Khar. Tank was situated in the remote tribal belt, and the women were kept in strict purdah. My mother hardly saw her husband, he only came indoors at night. The Nawab's 7 sons had been educated abroad, played croquet, flew their own small planes. However, when my mother became pregnant, the convent nuns who looked after her told her that it was believed that the family practiced infanticide. The Nawab had no living female offspring, which was in those days not uncommon amongst remote tribes. My mother left for Lahore to give birth at her own family home. This was quite normal. The wife stayed away from her husband for 40 days so that she could be well cared for and healthy enough to return to him. After her baby, my half-sister Rubina, was born, my mother demanded a divorce. Her father had died and her mother realized the pressure on her. Although the divorce was shocking, it was accepted by my mother's family, who had virtually lost her to the very backward family of Tank. She was branded as a divorcee, which was apparent by the reaction of my father's family to his decision to marry her. She was divorced, had a daughter and was Punjabi. Although my father's family could not match my mother's family in their affluence and social status, they were still very unhappy at his decision. Looking back, I realized that we were being raised to be schizophrenic. An appearance of perfection was more important than genuine feelings. There was no question of discovering oneself. Identity and individuality were crushed. Personality failed to develop. My mind became a sanctuary for secret thoughts of escaping from this household. But for that, there was no other goal in life but marriage. In 1968, my sister Rubina, only 17 and still at school, married a commercial airline pilot with the consent of her father, my mother's first husband. Although mother was appalled and very disturbed, everybody compromised swiftly and silently to avoid a scandal. By the time I was 16, nature had allowed me to evolve into a pretty young lady. I was thrilled to hear people say that I was beautiful, but in our household, this was a two-edged sword. Almost always a compliment was couched in the statement, "You look so much like your mother." The comparison only partially pleased me. My mother was stunning, yet I wanted to be beautiful in my own right and not compared to her. A comparison with her always left me in second place. I was convinced that I would fail any competition with her, therefore, the comparison always diluted the compliment. She looks so much like her mother, but, no, she is not a patch on her. Mother, too, silently resented the comparison. She remembered me as an ugly duckling and wished to remain as the family's standard bearer of beauty. Nevertheless, I attracted increasing attention. Weddings or any social gatherings were glorified marriage marts where women bartered their daughters' futures. Mother, like any Pakistani woman with 5 daughters to marry off, was an active player in this game. My sisters and I were allowed to converse only with our eyes. We flew north to Lahore to attend a wedding, and it was there that I met Ins Khan. His mother scrutinized me first and must have granted her approval. because he approached and asked, "You still studying?" "Yes," I replied. "Where?" "In Marie. At the convent." "Oh." He asked, "Which class are you in?" "I'm doing my senior Cambridge," I said. I thought little more of AIDS when I returned to the Roman Catholic boarding school I attended in the hillside summer resort town of Marie until one Sunday my classmates and I were allowed the treat of walking through the shopping mall. We were on guard. We knew that the mall was filled with Romeos on the prowl, strutting about for our benefit. We watched them discreetly, and giggled amongst ourselves. I was surprised when I saw Ains among this crowd, and even more shocked when he approached. Ains invited me and my friends to have tea with him at Sam's, Marie's famous restaurant. My friends and I shared nervous glances. A boarding school girl's dreams are fashioned of Sam's cakes and pastries, and we voted with our stomachs. As we ate the glorious chocolate eclairs, we glanced nervously at the clock and soon fled in undignified haste. Ains waved goodbye, and told me that he was leaving for Karachi the next day. But he did not go. I was shocked once more to see him, the following day, loitering outside the school gate. All I could think was, he must know that we are not allowed to converse with boys. He did not attempt to speak to me directly, rather, he smuggled in a note, via one of the day students. He wrote, "I am not going back to Karachi to my job because I want to be close to you. I will stay on in Marie. At least here I can catch a glimpse of you." I was in love. Each of the next 15 days Ains managed to have a letter smuggled into me, and I treasured them. When it was time to fly home for the summer holidays, I was armed with these letters, and with my resolve to tell my mother that he was the man I wished to marry. Ains and I travelled on the same plane, but we dared not to sit together or speak to one another. Once home in Karachi, my resolve wavered. I could not muster the courage to confront my mother face to face, so I penned a note, declaring that I had met a man who wanted to marry me, and left it underneath her pillow. Then I prayed to Allah. Catholic schooling never altered a student's commitment to Islam. On the prayer mat, I had a personal relationship with God. I confided in Allah and asked him to soften my mother's heart. That day mother disrupted my prayers, storming into my room livid, waving my note, demanding to know all the lurid details. I told her there were no details, only letters. She requisitioned the notes and I handed them over. As she read, I sat before her with my head bowed, blushing with shame. Mother informed me curtly that Ains's mother had already proposed the marriage, and she had turned down the proposal on grounds of my youth. But the real reason was that she felt that Ains was not good enough for me, or her. His family was not very well-to-do or well-known, and he was a mere junior executive, earning the paltry wage of 800 rupees, about £618, per month. On the basis of this information, Mother classified him as a loafer. After a few moments Mother informed me menacingly that she would speak to Ains and his mother, telling them once more that the marriage was out of the question. I was left in a void of embarrassment, disillusionment and hopelessness. My one ray of freedom had faded all too quickly. During the month's vacation I was a prisoner at home, forbidden to go out, forbidden to approach the telephone. Mother said few words to me, and when she did she made me feel unclean. Mother accompanied me back to school and spoke to the nuns, instructing them to do a better job of watching me, coercing them into censoring my mail. Deeply depressed, I tried to concentrate on my studies for the final exams, but I lived for the clandestine notes that Ains still, somehow, managed to smuggle in. I was also panic-stricken at the thought of losing a man whom love had blinded, so that now he perceived me as some great beauty. My low self-esteem convinced me and made me fearful that this era might never occur again. No other man would find it possible to love me. My mind turned to romance, and I began to look for signs of Aints in the smell of pines and in the sound of rain on the tin roof on a chilly night. I saw myself with him in the mountains, walking down narrow, winding, dirt roads. Marie was like Switzerland, and I would rather be here honeymooning than sitting for exams. He did not give up the struggle. His mother spoke to my mother on numerous occasions. Then he, too, began to call on her. She made them wait for endless hours and, when she did receive them, did so with arrogance. They took the treatment with patience and grace. I passed my final exams and returned home qualified with the requisite education for a fashionable marriage. By now Aints was 28 and I was 17. We were virtual strangers, but were convinced that we were deeply in love. There were other suitors, several more acceptable to mother, but I grew quietly stubborn and visibly rebellious for the first time. Aints was the first man to fall in love with me, and I felt somehow that he was my only chance for happiness and a speedy escape. I told my mother that, if I could not marry Aints, I would marry no one. For a time the standoff was bitter. But mother was in a bind. My father's conservative family worried that I would left a spinster. At 17, I should have been engaged. This was the worst humiliation for a Pakistani woman. My father's family was even more averse to my colouring than my mother's family. The Pathans are a very fair race. A dark Pathan like myself was quite rare and, in fact, terribly noticeable, and although I had lightened, I was still not quite the conventional beauty. But someone would surely marry me because of my father's position as airline chief, and that had Tom made use of quickly, while he still held the position. Visions of a scandal flashed through mother's mind, and she could not cope with the prospect of a stigma of this nature. As I tidied her dressing table, I overheard a conversation between my mother and her best friend, who said, "Samina, she's not your best-looking daughter. It won't be so easy for her to find a boy who'll love her as Aints does. I suggest you agree to the proposal. You still have 3 daughters for whom your position will be stronger." I did not hear my mother's answer. Aints's love and gushing compliments had allowed a little idea of beauty to creep into my mind, and it suddenly evaporated. I had heard the verdict. It was cruel, but I was sure that it was true. When I looked into the mirror over my mother's dressing table, there were no signs of a swan emerging. And so mother agreed to my marriage with Aints, and, having made the decision, she became the beaming mother of the bride-to-be. The engagement reception of S.U. Durrani's daughter was a great event. Baskets of sweetmeats were sent off to friends and relatives. Mother had a decorator flown in from Lebanon. My father was appointed governor of the State Bank of Pakistan, a position he valued highly in that it took him to the most prestigious point of his banking career. But then Pakistani politics intervened in our lives. In 1971, when the country was in the midst of upheaval and on the brink of war with India, Bhutto had approached my father with a proposition. At the time, Pakistan was divided into the 2 regions of East and West Pakistan, separated by 1,000 miles of India, and East Pakistan was attempting to secede and form the independent nation of Bangladesh. As governor of the State Bank, my father was a key sideline player. Bhutto, who was the leader of the People's Party, was now committed to fighting for the supremacy of West Pakistan. He asked my father surreptitiously to withdraw state assets from the East. Although my father was sympathetic, he refused to undertake such an unethical action, and Bhutto took the rebuff poorly. In December of that year, India finally invaded East Pakistan. General Yahya Khan accepted responsibility for the defeat and breakup of Pakistan and resigned, and Bhutto became the undisputed leader of all that remained of our country, what had formerly been West Pakistan. When the dust settled and Bhutto became president, one of his first actions was to dismiss my father as governor of the state bank. He had him arrested and thrown into a cockroach-infested prison cell on a trumped-up charge that he was in league with the CIA. My father's imprisonment was traumatic for the family. My mother endured the trauma with great dignity, although it broke her inwardly. She was shamed by the charges. In fact, she was quite unable to cope with the idea that her husband was blemished or marked professionally. This was always in private. Publicly she feigned courage and strength. My father's family and her own family were very supportive, as were some friends, like BCCI's Aga Hassan Ogdi, whose car was at mother's disposal. We moved out of the official residence to Rubina and Kamal's house. Mother was in mourning when alone or with the family. There were constant prayers, and women relatives and friends would read the Quran. Almost everybody in the house said their Ramaz prayers 5 times over for father's exoneration and health. I remember often crying at night for my father. Daytime was solemn and tense. There was no question of laughter or fun. My parents were humiliated. The perfect image of success, beauty and refinement seemed shattered by bad luck, we believed. I knew nothing about their financial worries, except that we no longer had the official residence and its ample facilities. The fact that we lived at Rubina's or in Lahore with Uncle Asad or Auntie Sama did bring home the truth that we had fallen from grace. I knew it would be difficult for my parents to restart a life without official power, and that they would have to live as ordinary people. Our own home had been rented out to a Japanese company, so they would have to rent a house. But the comforting feeling that I was engaged to be married detached me somewhat from their future plans. Only my mother, Rubina, and my father's brothers visited him in prison. We children were not taken, perhaps because we could not contribute to the serious matters that were being discussed. I missed my father a lot, and so did my little sisters and Asim. 6 months passed, and then the trial exonerated my father and he was released from prison. Although Bhutto attempted to make amends, my father, disgusted and humiliated, decided to leave the country. He accepted a post as vice president of the First National City Bank in the United States. I was relieved that he was still valued and could begin to continue his career without having to compromise further in Pakistan. My parents prepared to move to a suite in New York's Waldorf Astoria, but what were they to do with me? Mother concluded that the convenient course of action was to marry me off quickly in a simple ceremony. At first I was relieved that mother would not be in the same town, or indeed, the same country, as myself. The prospect of her leaving made me feel free. Until now she had been paramount in my life, although I had never felt the affection for her that I had felt for my father. The pain of parting from the rest of my family was diffused. Then reality dawned. 3 days prior to the wedding, it occurred to me that, despite our limited contact, I was already bored with Aints. I did not love him enough and most definitely did not want to marry him. I suddenly saw an alternative. If I traveled to the States with my parents, I might have more freedom and more opportunities to find whatever it was I sought. I locked myself inside my room and howled in distress. My grandmother stood outside my door, begging me to eat. Gradually I composed myself and resolved to face up to what had to be done. I spoke to Aints on the telephone and confided in him, "I probably do not love you. I was only in love with the idea of love. I wanted to escape from my family." He was disturbed but attempted to convince me that I was suffering from bridal jitters. "Everything will be all right," he counseled, "you are just nervous." My father offered similar reassurance. As I hugged him and wept on his shoulder, he lectured quietly. Daughters have to leave their homes and enter alien surroundings. A marriage, he said, was a confluence of grief and happiness. He understood my pain and ambivalence at the thought of leaving him, but I had to embark upon my future. I realized it was too late. No one believed that did not want to marry. They were all ascribing this to last-minute nerves. 3 days later I became a most confused bride. 2.5 years passed. My marriage to Ains reached a bland plateau. I knew that something was amiss, but did not have a clue as to what it was. Although I was now showered with compliments and loved dearly by my in-laws, my mind remained troubled by a childhood with which I did not know how to come to terms. I did not even know with what it was that I had to come to terms. I was haunted by feelings of being a non-person and by extremely low self-esteem. If mother did not approve of me and love me, Ains's weak opinion, and those of his lower positioning family, was of little consequence. When my daughter Tanya was born, I was not only bewildered but puzzled at having become a mother, understanding little of the women into which I was developing. Emotionally I was hopelessly immature, as I struggled to cope with what should have been the most rewarding relationship between mother and daughter. I loved Tanya dearly, and yet I felt so unfulfilled as a child and daughter myself. My own craving for motherhood still remained, and weighed heavily upon me. I tried to compensate through Tanya, playing with her, dressing her, and loving her, as if she might be me and I my mother. I knitted and embroidered clothes for her. She had a nanny, but I always took her even though it was only ever to my in-laws. I worried constantly about her food, spoon-feeding her with mashed bananas and mashed potatoes. The fatter she became, the happier I was. I still did not love Ains. If I had, perhaps I would have found Mustafa Khar less intriguing, and less troubling. Too, that Mustafa was authoritarian, conservative and overpowering, I knew from the start, but that was precisely what attracted me so much. Psychologically, I had suffered from my father's weak role in our family. Now here was someone who presented a quite different personality. The men of the Carol tribe are known to be taller than average, with marked features and legendary energy and endurance. One scholar described them as wasteful in marriage expenditure, hospitable to travelers, thievish and with little taste for agriculture. A Persian proverb holds that they are rebellious and ought to be slain. Their roots go back to the Nelibar region of India, near Kamalir, but they fell into a dispute with the British rulers when they refused to pay tribute. After several lethal encounters, they decided to move west. They slaughtered their women and children so as not to impede their journey, then packed their vast stores of gold and migrated to the Punjab, settling along the banks of the Indus River. There are various versions as to why, in modern times, one branch of the family shortened its name to Khar. One of those holds that the name was bestowed by an angry victim of their plunder, who dubbed them with the name Khar because it means ass in Persian. But the more likely explanation is that their religious beliefs made them refrain from using the full name, out of respect for their mystical leader, Sheri, who was himself a Carol. Whatever the truth of the matter, it is certain that the Khars consider themselves superior to those who cling to the old name. By systematically marrying the daughters of tribal chieftains, Mustafa's grandfather, Malik Ghulam, eventually became one of the largest landowners in the Muzaffargarh district of the Punjab. In the feudal system, wealth equates with honor and power. Thus in 1940 Mustafa's father, Muhammad Khar, was granted the title Khan Sahib by the British Crown. Muhammad Khar was 64 years old when he married his third wife, a 16-year-old girl from Multan, who became Mustafa's mother. All told, Khan Sahib had 16 children. Mustafa's mother bore him 7 sons and a daughter. The 7 sons grew up in their isolated village of Kotadu with little discipline from their aging father and submissive mother. Like his brothers, Mustafa was raised by a pair of nannies, who breastfed him for the first 6 years of his life. The women's diet was carefully monitored and, during their wet nurse years, the nannies were allowed to visit their husbands only in the presence of a supervisor, to guard against pregnancy. The Khar brothers attribute their vigor to this childhood nurturing. As young feudal lords, Mustafa and his brothers had few worries concerning legal and societal prescriptions. The feudal system is a carryover from the time when the British ruled the whole of South-Central Asia. By bestowing land and absolute power upon certain loyal individuals, the white masters were able to control the country's multitudes with relatively little effort. With the passage of time, the privileged few multiplied their wealth by exploiting the feudal practices of tenant farming and arbitrary taxation. Feudalism was a license to plunder, rape, and even murder. The rich got richer, the poor despaired. In the areas that were later to become Pakistan, some feudal families utilized Islam as a weapon of control. The patriarchs were venerated as holy men, who spoke with Allah. And, indeed, at some earlier time many were pious and righteous. But gradually power passed to elder sons who were neither pious nor particularly moral, yet were revered by the illiterate people of the area and perceived as envoys of Allah. They had the authority to justify their every deed on the basis of their own, quite convenient, interpretation of the Quran. A feudal lord was an absolute ruler who could justify any action. When British rule ended in 1947, the stage was set for at least 4 half-century of turmoil. The vast holdings of the Commonwealth were divided along religious lines. The Hindu stronghold became India. Muslim Pakistan was a country like no other in the world, divided into 2 slabs of land by the immense impediment of India. Democracy took hold in India and the feudal system collapsed. But in Pakistan, although lip service was paid to democratic principles, feudal lords remained in control. It was they who decided who would sit in the National Assembly and who would reside in the Prime Minister's house. The Khar family elders were not interested in politics. Mustafa and his brothers lived for shikar, the hunt. They stayed away from home for days at a time, tracking their prey, mostly on horseback, sometimes on foot. Once they achieved success, they could not wait to taste its delights. They enjoyed cooking the food themselves and ate the meat rare. Shikar taught Mustafa courage, endurance, and patience. And through hunting he grasped the importance of strategy and tactical maneuvering. He learned how to lure, entice, and entrap. When he was barely 17, at the decision of his father, Mustafa told me later, he had married his illiterate cousin, Waiza, who was many years older than him. She immediately became pregnant. Mustafa ran away from his village and his fate, fleeing first to Multan and then to the great city of Lahore. Here he was fascinated by such mysteries as the sight of a woman with a stylish hairdo sitting cool and poised behind the steering wheel of a shiny car. He lacked the social graces necessary to approach such a nice maiden. At the moment, he could only lust from a distance. At the hillside resort of Marie, Mustafa met women who purveyed their charms for a price, and he discovered that he was comfortable with professional sex. He scoured the market, inspected the wares and hired the services. For their part, the women were fascinated by this wealthy young feudal chieftain who bemoaned his enforced marriage. Back home, Waiza suffered in silence. Her humiliation was compounded when the elders dissolved her marriage to Mustafa and gave her to her much younger brother-in-law. But at least she was spared the indignity of returning to her parents' home as a divorcee, which, in the feudal system, is a dismal destiny. She bore Mustafa's first son, Abdurrahman. Meanwhile, in Marie, Mustafa befriended a man who had an attractive and somewhat educated sweetheart, FEUDAL. When FEUDAL discovered that she was pregnant, the man fled and Mustafa provided a comfortable crying shoulder. To Mustafa, the fallen FEUDAL was a victim of society. He married her on impulse, and in the course of time FEUDAL gave birth to a son, bearing Mustafa's surname. And within a year a second son, Bilu, was born. All this responsibility proved too much for Mustafa, who now decided that he had confused sympathy with love. Even as FEUDAL was in the hospital recuperating from Bilu's birth, Mustafa sent her divorce papers. Somewhat chastened, Mustafa returned to his village and, in typical feudal fashion, was forgiven by his elders. The men of the Khar family were content with their isolated domain, and saw no reason to expand the scope of their vision, until the time-old pattern of power worship gave them a jolt. Mushtaq Ahmed Ghumani became governor of the Punjab. The Ghumani clan lived in an adjoining area and, suddenly having become so important, began to make its presence felt. Over time, in bureaucratic fashion, the loyalties of local officials were deflected. The police turned a blind eye to crimes committed by Ghumani clansmen against the Khars. The precious water supply was diverted. Perhaps worse, the peasants began to pay more attention to the new political leaders than to their traditional lords. It was in 1962 when the Khars realized that their feudal world could no longer function without political clout. Only politics could bring legitimacy, power, and protection. Mustafa was 24 years old when he stood for a seat in the National Assembly. He was a novice, but an energetic one. Patiently, he traveled from family to family within the region, explaining his concern for the erosion of their traditional power in the area. He was pleased to discover that another powerful feudal clan, the Legharis, were equally concerned by the political encroachment of the rival Ghumani clan, and he was able to form a strong coalition that resulted in victory. Mustafa would be the first of the Khars to travel to the prestigious National Assembly. Ecstatic over his win, Mustafa's father presented his son with a substantial sum of money. This he squandered on several shiny new American cars. At times, as he drove one of his new toys to Parliament, he instructed drivers to follow with his other vehicles, producing a showy cavalcade. Inside the National Assembly, Mustafa remained silent, very conscious of his status as a country neophyte. But he listened carefully and absorbed everything. Fortuitously, seated next to him was Ghulam Mustafa Khan Jatoi, a distinguished-looking, slightly older man who came from one of the largest and wealthiest feudal families in the Sindh province in the southern half of West Pakistan. Mustafa Jatoi was a valuable new friend for Mustafa, a relationship that was to last for 26 years and with whom his political fortunes were to remain closely linked. Jatoi introduced Mustafa to the dynamic foreign minister, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and the two men began a complex relationship that was to vacillate between the extremes of love and hate. Like many young men at that time, Mustafa fell under the magnetic spell of Bhutto, a hard-working leftist politician who cried out for social justice. For his part, Bhutto was impressed with Mustafa's potential as a true son of the soil, a man who understood the aspirations of the people and had the ability to address their issues. Following the Tashkent Agreement in 1966, which ended the Second India-Pakistan War, Bhutto, believing that President Ayub Khan had won the war on the battlefield but lost it across the negotiating table, resigned his post as foreign minister. He was an immediate political pariah, and as he prepared to board a train to return home to Karachi, no one came to bid him farewell, except for Mustafa Khar. The younger man did so in direct defiance of the establishment and of the sympathies of the Nawab of Calabar, the feudal governor of the Punjab, and this was an indication of the anti-establishment course of Mustafa's political career. Bhutto, who was a shrewd and cunning politician, immediately saw that there was more to Mustafa than a silly 24-year-old who arrived at Parliament in a parade of American-made automobiles. He commented on Mustafa's show of courage, and Mustafa responded with his favorite, enigmatic phrase, "Time will tell." Women entered Mustafa's life speedily and left just as quickly. The young member of the National Assembly was still searching for the nebulous ideal, but he lacked the self-confidence necessary to court women of society, and for a time continued to settle for low-life companionship. During one of his numerous flights to attend Parliament sessions in East Pakistan, Mustafa was smitten by an apparition in green, the flight attendant who served him his meal. Her name was Safia, and she was from a lower middle-class background, working to help support her family. A feudal lord rarely met such a liberated woman elsewhere. Safia exuded an aura of adventure. They spent the next 2 days together and married. Mustafa immediately reverted to the dictates of his feudal heritage. He plucked Safia from the sky and locked her in a cage. His formerly modern bride went behind the veil, banished to the oblivion of his home village of Kotadoo, where her mission was to live in anticipation of his infrequent visits. At the time, there was no electricity or plumbing in Kotadoo. The women of the family were completely isolated from the outside world. The only sky Safia saw here was the patch above the compound of her new home. The walls were built high and no males other than her father-in-law and brothers-in-law could enter. She grew reconciled to a desert life, the area being renowned for its barrenness and dry heat, and became part of the Zanana, women's chambers, where in every sense the male was king and the female slave. Here, Safia bore Mustafa a son, named Bilal, and a daughter who, owing to a lack of medical facilities, died of diarrhea. It was at this time that Mustafa was called upon to perform a special duty under the Jirga system, whereby the feudal lord acts as judge and jury to settle disputes among his vassals out of court. Sentences are passed by consensus or merely on the lord's authority. The case of two lovers was brought before him and he listened attentively to the allegations against them. The woman, Aisha, was in her mid-20s, a beauty who resembled the American film actress Ava Gardner. She was tall and regal-looking, with glowing brown skin and deep black eyes. Aisha was known in Kotadoo for her mischievous and lively nature, and this earned her a reputation for being fast. Apparently she made eyes at the young village men and constantly tried to attract attention. Her case was weak. She was a married woman who had fallen in love with another man, also married. Throwing convention and religion to the winds they had impulsively eloped, and now it was Mustafa's duty to decide the punishment. For Mustafa this was an easy decision. He recognized that Aisha was the legal property of her husband, and ordered her to be returned to him. The lovers had fled for sanctuary to a holy shrine near Multan, but they were caught and brought before Mustafa. Aisha pleaded not to be forced to return to her husband and begged, instead, to be allowed to work for Mustafa and his family. For daring to disobey him, Mustafa committed Aisha's lover to an asylum, where he soon grew truly mad and died. But Aisha was installed as Bilal's nanny. Mustafa agreed to give her family a small portion of wheat each year, but other than that she received no wages. Henceforth she became known by the name of Aisha and was, like numerous others, a household slave. Mustafa became Bhutto's protégé and, leaving Safia in the village, he moved into Bhutto's residence at 70 Clifton in Karachi, where he was to live for many years, and where his political and social education began in earnest. The curriculum included the intricate tactics of how to mesh an elegant lifestyle with political ambitions. One of Bhutto's heroes was the Indonesian president, Sukarno, who understood that third world peoples are emotional and illiterate, and require simple oratorical slogans to keep them loyal to their politicians. In this view, the masses are attracted to colorful leaders whose romantic liaisons are not so much overlooked as expected. This philosophy allowed Sukarno to live a private life filled with romantic intrigue. Bhutto viewed moral license as one of the privileges of power, and his disciple learned the lesson well. Citing Sukarno, Bhutto often said that exceptional men needed extraordinary wives who were understanding and able to cope with their husbands' eccentricities. As an example, he referred to Adolf Hitler's liaison with Eva Braun. Bhutto did, indeed, have an extraordinary wife, the Iranian-born Nusrat. For years she was forced to live with the open secret that her husband was carrying on an affair with the beautiful and vivacious divorcee, Husna Sheikh. Bhutto was passionately in love, but at the time Husna played hard to get, skeptical of her suitor's playboy reputation. Mustafa now became his confidant and often drove Bhutto to his clandestine meetings with Husna. Bhutto also had a passion for Persian and Chinese carpets, and would pay lavishly for any piece that caught his fancy. If he coveted a friend's carpet, he would not leave the house until they had struck a bargain. Unlike India's Prime Minister Nehru, Bhutto loved roses, and grew specimen plants in his gardens. The teacher nurtured student as carefully as his prize roses, tutoring him in both political and personal behavior. The elder coached the younger on the importance of clothes which, in Bhutto's case, tended to be rather rakish. Soon, Mustafa was sporting the same style of Savile Row suits and Turnbull and Arthur shirts as his mentor. Bhutto's library was one of the best in Asia, and here his most prized possession was his collection of books on Napoleon Bonaparte. He was fascinated by the little Corsican who had the audacity to crown himself Emperor of France. Bhutto presented Mustafa with a recommended reading list, and later questioned him on what he had read of it. Mustafa did not totally succumb, but tried to preserve his identity and earthiness. They made an odd couple. At breakfast, for example, Bhutto ate his fried eggs and baked beans as Mustafa, proud of his culinary heritage, insisted on the traditional foods of the rural Punjab: lassi, a yogurt drink; paratha, a thin, flat bread cooked in butter, and an omelette with green peppers and tomatoes. This was a mutually beneficial friendship. Bhutto discerned intelligence and native cunning in Mustafa, although it was unschooled. The younger man understood the plight of the illiterate, impoverished masses. Both men, even as they enjoyed the trappings of power and prestige, ached to move Pakistan into the 20th century. Mustafa came to see the irony in their political quest, for in order to bring true democracy and equality, and thus progress, to the country, they had to find some way to destroy the archaic feudal system. If they were to realize their political ambitions, they had to annihilate their very own power base. Mustafa continued to live the good life, and this revolved around Bhutto's spectacular dinner parties. Each was a major event for Pakistan's social and cultural elite. Bhutto was expert at the finer points of cuisine, and he dictated every detail of the menu. He loved French food and was a connoisseur of fine wines, and selected with great care. He personally chose the china and cutlery. He inspected the attire and procedures of the retinue of servants. He even supervised the floral arrangements. In 1967, Mustafa became one of the founding members of Bhutto's Pakistan People's Party, committed to fighting for the liberal cause. For the common man its message was powerful, but for several years the new Socialist Party had to struggle. Its leaders toured the remotest areas of the country, reaching out to the people who, they believed, were the real power. Bhutto's zeal and energy filtered almost everywhere, and very soon his hard work established the People's Party as a major voice of reform. Mustafa waited for the moment when events would pave his way to power. Pakistan was a nation in transition, and its political life was tumultuous. In the 1970 elections the People's Party swept to victory in West Pakistan, but the Awami League, which had raised a 6-point program that had separatist undertones, captured all but 2 seats in East Pakistan. This plunged the nation into a deep and divisive crisis. East Pakistan exploded into riots, aimed at winning independence from West Pakistan. The People's Party's regional triumph thrust Mustafa into prominence. He was suddenly caught by power seekers, some of whom threw lavish but sleazy parties where women were part of the menu. At one of these events, Mustafa met Noorbaha, a professional dancing girl who used her face and her body to ensnare the young politician. Mustafa rented a house in Lahore and installed Noorbaha there as his mistress. Then he married her, despite the fact that he had a wife waiting for him in Cottadoo. The Quran allows a man to have as many as 4 wives, but, tempers this with the almost impossible requirement that he love them equally. He made Nur Bahar promise to keep the marriage a secret. Within a year, fueled by a hostile press, mainly in India and Britain, the battle for the liberation of Bangladesh had begun. The West seemed to have misread the plight of that. My Feudal Lord, Tehmina Durrani, copyright symbol www.sonopionwar.com 23. East Pakistani people. West Pakistan was attempting to stop the Indian government's dismemberment of their country, but it was projected as though we were the villains by not allowing autonomy to a people demanding their rights and freedom. In December 1971, Indian troops exploited the situation into East Pakistan under the pretext of protecting refugees. The previous two wars between India and Pakistan, in 1948-9 and 1965, had been inconclusive, but this time Indian armed forces, benefiting from a shared border with East Pakistan and the allegiance of the local populace, prevailed. The Pakistani army and air force were severely crippled. Bangladesh secured its independence. By the end of 1971, West Pakistan was simply and humbly Pakistan. It would be a while before we recognized Bangladesh as a country. In the meantime, a coalition of military men determined that it was time for new leadership to overcome this setback and installed Bhutto as president and chief administrator of martial law. Operating from his center of power in Islamabad, the capital of the new Pakistan, he proved his acumen with a series of swift, effective strokes that settled tensions between Pakistan and Bangladesh, and won the release of 93,000 Pakistani POWs held by the Indians. Then, knowing that he owed his newfound power to the military and would continue to be subject to the demands of the generals who had installed him, he coerced them into resigning and replaced them with men more loyal to him. Bhutto appointed his young protege as governor and administrator of martial law, in the Punjab, the most powerful of the remaining provinces in Pakistan, and ironically this great moment of triumph brought Mustafa's secret marriage to Nur Bahar into the open. Word of Mustafa's new prominence encouraged the dancing girls of Punjab to cavort joyously in the narrow old city streets, publicly celebrating the fact that one of them was the new governor's wife. After the swearing-in ceremony, Mustafa drove to meet Nur Bahar at her family home in an official limousine. As the garish car wound its way into the red light district, Mustafa was mobbed by fans. Hearing of this, Bhutto summoned Mustafa and warned that he must not flaunt his position with impunity. The governor of the Punjab could not have a common dancer as his wife. Mustafa was told to correct the situation immediately. He divorced Nur Bahar. Safia was rescued from the exile of Kotadu and installed in the governor's house as the legitimate and respectable wife, but this illusion was shattered almost immediately. Mustafa's brothers came to him. Now you are governor, your honor is at stake. Your wife has had an illicit relationship with your younger brother, Ghulam Murtaza. We cannot hide this fact from you any longer. It did not matter that Mustafa had ruined Safia's life, that he had also married Nur Bahar and ruined her life, that he had visited Safia for mere hours in the course of their 7-year marriage, that he did not love her. Feudal law allows a man to act in such a manner, but for a wife to betray a husband is the supreme sin. Mustafa's world tumbled about him. He was the cuckold, the object of sniggering whispers. He flew to Islamabad to seek solace from his mentor. The President of Pakistan and the Governor of the Punjab drank late into the night, and their conversation took on a philosophical tone. Mustafa indulged in self-pity and pathos. He told Bhutto that he wished to resign, he could not concentrate on affairs of state. Because of this great betrayal, his self-esteem was shattered, he had lost confidence in himself. Bhutto placed an arm around Mustafa's shoulder and proposed drunkenly, I think we should both resign. We should give up this government. There is nothing but pain and betrayal in life. If you resign, I will too. I cannot work alone. I've suffered your pain too. Let's just go away somewhere, damn it, away from all this. But in the sober light of morning, Bhutto chastised Mustafa and told him not to be so stupid and give way to emotions. They had a great destiny. They were the chosen ones. They had to bring about change in Pakistan. History would not forgive them if they showed weakness, especially for a mere woman. Bhutto's expression turned serious and he suggested, with sincerity, I say, why don't you bump her off? Mustafa let the suggestion pass. In his feudal moral scheme, Islamic law allows a man to kill his unfaithful wife in a fit of passion, but does not allow for premeditated vengeance. So he simply divorced Sophie and banished his offending younger brother to Britain. It was at this time that I married Aunts. Bhutto wanted Mustafa to marry again, and the search was soon on for a modern woman who could serve as the ideal hostess for the governor's house. Bhutto was ready to embark on his first trip to the US as president of Pakistan when Mustafa met Sherazad, the niece by marriage of Bhutto's education minister. Sherry was extremely beautiful and westernized. As was his pattern in these matters, Mustafa acted compulsively. He was to accompany Bhutto to the US, and he was in a hurry to have a charming, well-bred and, best of all, stunning woman on his arm as he walked into the White House. Bhutto was against the union. Sherry was from an upwardly mobile, anglicized, middle-class background, and Bhutto reasoned that she would not find Mustafa's feudal background compatible. But Mustafa indicated categorically that he would not blindly follow Bhutto. It was a further signal that he would not, now or later, take any instruction concerning his private life. This was to become the great contradiction in his character. He ignored Bhutto's objection and proposed. Sherry accepted and, 9 days later, with the president attending, she became his fifth wife. Mustafa served as governor for a year. When a new constitution was adopted in 1973, Bhutto became prime minister and Mustafa's title was changed to chief minister of the Punjab. He developed a reputation as an effective administrator. His close relationship with Bhutto provided him with both the real and assumed power to crush any opposition. The euphoria of a new, people's government hung in the air. Mustafa genuinely believed in the party slogan, "The fountainhead of power is the people." When the police force went on strike, Mustafa labeled the action a mutiny and appealed to the people to take charge of law and order, to man the police posts and even direct traffic. This worked, and backed up Mustafa's ultimatum to the police that anyone who did not return to work within 24 hours would be fired. They returned. It was during this period that Bhutto sent Mustafa to Washington as his most trusted emissary, to meet President Nixon and deliver a special message. Exhibiting a native canniness, Mustafa used the power of his office to re-establish his financial position. Over the years he had sold off much of his land holdings in order to finance his political aspirations. When he took over as governor, he owned only a paltry area of Cottadoo. But now those who had bought from him found themselves hauled in by the police on trumped-up charges and coerced into returning his land. Before long, Mustafa had recouped almost all of his holdings. Mustafa crushed opposition with the fierce hand of a feudal lord. When the students of Punjab University went on strike, closing down the institution and resorting to hooliganism, Mustafa was alleged to have had them stripped naked and marched in the street. Some political leaders and opponents were said to have been sodomized in prison. Mustafa was compared to the Nawab of Calabar, the previous governor, favorably for his administrative abilities and negatively for his cruel tactics. On the other hand, the gates of the governor's house and, later, the chief minister's house, were open to the people of his constituency every Friday. He gave priority to the people he represented and precedence to their problems. However, gradually the relationship between Bhutto and Mustafa grew strained. The chief minister of the Punjab was now a politician in his own right, emerging from the shadow of his mentor. Bhutto knew that the Punjab, being the largest province, was the vote bank of Pakistan, and thus the backbone of the People's Party. He could not afford to lose it to his own Frankenstein monster. Everywhere Mustafa went he was greeted with the slogan Sher-e-Punjab, Lion of the Punjab, and he acted the part of the number 2 man in Pakistan, which he was. Bhutto worried that Mustafa's inflated ego might persuade him to go his own way in politics, and, if he believed himself to be the number 2 man, there was only one job to which he could aspire. Indeed, there was reason to worry. Bhutto had many enemies. People with vested interests regarded his theories of Islamic socialism as anathema. They realized that if the Punjab could be extricated from Bhutto's control he would fall, and they started to form a wedge between the 2 men. Mustafa also began to undertake crucial initiatives without first clearing them with the Prime Minister. Disagreements sprang up both on policy matters and personnel appointments. If Bhutto rejected Mustafa's nominees, Mustafa sulked and turned down the alternatives presented by Bhutto. He developed a strong political personality of his own. Islamabad was abuzz with stories of his megalomania. He was rumored to have said that he would be the next Prime Minister. The people of the Punjab would catapult him into power. Bhutto's advisors suggested to him that 2 swords could not be accommodated in one scabbard. Bhutto loved Mustafa like his own son and tried to admonish him like a father. In return Mustafa pleaded his case. He argued that his emergence as a leader in his own right would enhance Bhutto's rule. A prime minister could not be expected to oversee everything. The People's Party needed a strong second-line leadership. On several occasions Mustafa reaffirmed his loyalty and support to Bhutto as well as to the party, but his pledges did not hold water. He referred to himself as Bhutto's shock absorber. "I take the flak and criticism upon myself," he proclaimed. "I do not direct it towards you." But Bhutto knew that Mustafa was chipping away at his power base. It was not long after Mustafa became chief minister that he and Bhutto began to disagree. At a cabinet meeting in Karachi the tension finally erupted. At Mustafa's instruction, a Punjabi bureaucrat presented a paper that argued in favor of protecting the Punjab's water resources. Bhutto interrupted enraged, "Nobody can tell me how to allocate resources between the provinces of the country. If I wish I can divert everything to Larkana, a village near the river Indus in the south. I have the mandate of the people." "That, sir, is not correct," Mustafa responded. "You have a mandate to serve the people of this country as a whole. Not only your village of Larkana. As long as I am chief minister of the Punjab, I will protect the interests of the Punjab." Bhutto threw his papers onto the table and stormed out of the room, muttering, "Either I stay Prime Minister of Pakistan or you become Prime Minister." Mustafa's colleagues gathered around him and warned that he had overstepped the bounds of his authority and urged him to apologize. Mustafa immediately sought out Bhutto in his chambers and did so. Bhutto accepted the apology, but noted, "You're getting out of hand. I won't tolerate such insolence in public again. Talk to me privately next time." Following this episode, the tension grew to intolerable proportions. Mustafa had many colleagues who were jealous of his very trusted and comfortable position with Bhutto. On the other hand, Bhutto was paranoid about a Punjabi leader wresting power from My Feudal Lord, Tehmina Durrani. Copyright symbol www.sonopionwar.com 27. Him. In 1974, an Islamic summit was held in the Punjab, attended by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, Libya's Colonel Gaddafi, the PLO's Yasser Arafat, Idi Amin, and many other important Arab leaders. Mustafa presided over the summit at Bhutto's side. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was also there. It was at this summit that Pakistan at last accepted the independence of East Pakistan. Following the meeting, Mustafa tendered his resignation and moved from the chief minister's house into a rented house. And soon after that, I met him at the Punjab Club in Lahore. 3. The morning after we attended the reception at the Punjab Club, Ains and I received a call from one of Mustafa Khar's friends, inviting us to lunch. Ains had a previous commitment and was desperately disappointed. "No problem," said the persistent voice on the phone. "We'll have dinner together." That evening, Ains and I became part of the charmed circle. Our new group of friends had one thing in common: Mustafa Khar. The Lion of the Punjab had entered our lives, and we were now two of the many satellites in orbit about him. Almost every day our group met for lunch or dinner. Mustafa was at his most passionate whenever the conversation turned to politics. He was a socialist who wanted to do away with the feudal system that impeded progress in Pakistan, even though he was part of it himself. "I feel disgust for the upper classes," he raged. "I have no time for them. I'm not interested in their acceptance. They are merely the litter of the British stooges." He preached that Pakistan was made for people who wanted to get on in this world, people who expected to gain now that the power structure had been freed from the Hindus and the feudal elite. The people who should have power are the rickshaw drivers, the peasants, the factory workers. He could smell the sweat of the poor and underprivileged in his nostrils, and he had styled himself as their leader. He argued that the unchecked accumulation of wealth must not be permitted. He wanted to take from the rich and give to the poor in a system where opportunities were more equal and where resources were more equitably distributed. He supported trade unions and other countervailing forces to curb the capitalists. He was eloquent when he proclaimed, "The proletariat is the responsibility of the industrialist. Their children must be educated by the industrialist. There must be job security, welfare provisions, medical facilities, and childcare centers for working mothers. Low-cost housing schemes must be initiated. The big industrial houses must contribute to society by setting up schools, colleges, hospitals, and orphanages. They must repay their debt to Pakistan instead of feathering their own nests all the time." I found this deliciously exciting. This was the sort of man considered very dangerous by people like my parents. Such radicals were regarded as preachers of hatred who traded in false hopes and widened the already vast chasm between the affluent and the indigent. They allowed the genie of rising expectations to escape from the bottle. Mustafa articulated thoughts that had buzzed in my brain since childhood. I was a product of the powerful, privileged class, but I had been a misfit, an underdog in my own surroundings. I understood the zeal, for I was rebel in search of a cause. Mustafa Khar defined the cause for me. For the first time in my life, I felt a purpose beyond mere existence. He noted my interest, and from then on made a point of steering the conversation toward politics. He could sense that I was hooked. He was the perfect gentleman to the women in our group, treating them with respect, courtesy, and even veneration. Whenever a woman entered the room, he stood and offered her a chair. His impeccable manners seemed to come naturally. I had heard whispered accusations that he was coarse and vulgar, but I saw no trace of these traits. I saw, instead, the epitome of good breeding. Powerless to prevent it, I felt pulled by an undercurrent. I was magnetically attracted to him. All at once my marriage to Ains seemed very dull. I no longer loved him. I longed for excitement. Yet Mustafa was married to a beautiful woman who appeared to be devoted to him. He was 42, 20 years older than I was. He was mature. I felt like an incorrigibly romantic schoolgirl. As one dinner party merged with another, dreadful, tempting thoughts plagued me. I knew that illicit liaisons were endemic in our social milieu, although one never admitted to them in public, but the combination of my Catholic schooling and Muslim faith produced a strong taboo. I believed that there was safety in numbers. Everyone who attended the social functions in our new crowd of friends did so with his or her spouse. There were no bachelors and no girlfriends. The male conversation, when it strayed from politics, often revolved around hunting, planning expeditions, or recounting favorite stories of the great hunts. The women listened with pride and no traces of boredom. Ains was not a hunter. To my surprise, I discovered loneliness amidst the crowd Ains, and I could not participate in these discussions, so we tried our best to become avid listeners. At times, the conversational tone deteriorated to a very low level. Quite oblivious to the presence of their wives, the men spoke ecstatically about the sensual dances known as mudras. The custom came from the days of the Mughal emperors, when the courtesans were very well-bred and refined women trained to dance, sing and please men. Nawabs and noblemen sent their teenage sons to them for entertainment and etiquette training. Virgins always commanded the premium price. By modern times, the custom still existed but had deteriorated. The women were now lowly, uneducated peasant girls who merely danced sensuously. The tinkle of their ankle bells enticed men to throw rupee notes at their feet. The men in our new social circle took delight in discussing the intricacies of the dancers' movements, on the floor and in bed, and spoke openly of the rates they charged for the night. The wives suppressed their feelings and pretended to treat these discussions as harmless male fantasies. It was all very alien to me, and I decided that the elite was sophisticated enough to deal openly with risque topics. It did not occur to me at the time that, for these men, this was simply another version of discussing the hunt. Some of our old friends warned Ains about Mustafa's reputation. He's a womanizer, a compulsive Casanova. The man is evil. He'll damage you. But Ains was unmoved. Mustafa was his new and powerful friend, and Ains believed that the social relationship would pay personal and professional dividends. He was too charmed by Mustafa, too busy enjoying his newfound status, to worry about his young wife. Mustafa made no direct overtures. He said nothing to me that could be remotely construed as flirting, yet his eyes continued to cast an unmistakable message. He was formal without being stiff, friendly, but at a carefully cultivated distance. He did not contrive to get me alone. It was as if he were taking extra care to wash away the blots on his reputation. His actions broadcast the message: I'm not a lecture, I'm merely misunderstood. A more sensitive husband might have noticed the signs, but Ains never suspected. His placid and complacent nature began to irritate me. I prayed that he would notice. That he would stop me before I went over the brink. I understood the danger, but the abyss enticed me, inexorably. I knew that I would most certainly fall. Mustafa's shabby, greasy and unkempt home was my first indication about the state of his marriage. Some of the chairs on the veranda were broken, their paint peeling, their upholstery threadbare. Everything in the living room matched the turquoise-colored sofas, the lamps, paintings, rugs and ashtrays, even a waste paper basket, were turquoise. Thank God, the wall-to-wall carpeting and the walls were white. It seemed like a furniture showroom selected as a complete setting. The rest of the house was a mess. It smelled of food cooking in the kitchen and old fruit. Sherry walked through the chaos unfazed as my mind presumptuously redecorated the house to suit my taste. I thought, Elle would not save food with the threat of flies falling into it. How can she allow this? Where are the flowers? Has she not heard of house plants? Where is the woman's touch? Mustafa did not mind living this way. It was not his priority. But if he had hoped that Sherry would bring some comfort and class into his home, she had disappointed him. Mustafa may have been only vaguely aware of what he expected in a home, but this could not even be a mild approximation of his ideal. His eyes searched me out and silently complained. Mine responded. On one occasion, Ains and I happened to be visiting Mustafa and Sherry as they packed for a trip to Matri. I found she bending over an enormous shipping trunk, stowing Mustafa's clothes: a muslin kurta, loose shirt, a grey coat more in keeping with the First World War, t-shirts, safari suits, starched dress shirts, striped shirts, checked shirts, footwear that ranged from Wellingtons to crocodile shoes, every conceivable style of trousers, every conceivable style of suit. I asked, "Are you going away for long?" "No," Sherry answered casually, without looking up. Then she turned her attention to a second large wooden chest. She inventoried its contents: Pharmaton, multivitamins, cough syrups, cod liver capsules, Listerine, throat paint, iodine, Litrosin, Alka-Seltzer, blood pressure pills, varieties of aspirin, bandages, band-aids, scissors, eye drops, nose drops, thermometer. "Is Mustafa that ill?" I asked in bewilderment. Sherry glanced up and remarked cryptically, "No. But you never know what he may want." The more I learned, the more I came to understand his inability to maintain a stable marriage. I rationalized that, had he found the right woman at the right time, he would have settled down as a good husband. But his reasons for marriage were always wrong, based on expediency rather than love. He seemed to marry women in transit. His political life exposed him to a high-powered world. He was changing and evolving all the time, and he tended to outgrow his women. I became curious about his relationship with Sherry. It seemed to be in a state of disequilibrium. Her position as his wife should have given her stature, yet his condescending treatment made her servile. Mustafa was the boss, the brain, the soul. Sherry was in awe of him, and rarely made a remark that was not drenched in his thoughts. She dared not differ from his views. She looked to him for constant approval. The strength of his personality diminished her to the point where she existed only in the reflection of his light. Sherry had surrendered her will to Mustafa, and I saw this as her failure. Since Sherry was powerless in her relationship with her husband, she often flexed her muscles in other directions, with inappropriate and hostile treatment of the servants, and especially her 7-year-old stepson Dalal. At times it seemed that she went out of her way to make trouble for the boy, perhaps in an effort to deflect Mustafa's aggression away from her and onto a surrogate target. The dynamics of the family fascinated me. Yet I remained convinced that the failure was with Sherry, not Mustafa. She was simply not woman enough for this charismatic, powerful man. On one occasion, Ains and I drove Sherry to furniture shop. On the way home I wanted to stop and pick up some food, but Sherry was nervous. She glanced sidelong at her companion, the ever-present Aisha, who functioned more as a stool pigeon than a servant, and said, "We can't stop here." "Why not?" I asked. "Because I didn't tell Mustafa that he's stopping here to pick up food." "So what?" "I can't," Sherry said adamantly. "I don't have his permission. He'll be very angry." I suggested, "Just tell him I decided to do so on the spur of the moment." "No. He'll be very angry. He'll beat me. He beats me if I do anything without his permission." "Don't tell him," I said. "That's impossible," she countered, pointing toward Dai. "She will." We did not stop for food. In public, Mustafa treated Sherry with contempt. In conversation, with her there at his side, he constantly declared that Sherry was the wrong woman for him, and he made no secret of the fact that he was in the market for the perfect wife. "I've made another mistake," he would say. "I'll have to marry again." She laughed off the insults, pretending, and obviously hoping, that he was speaking in jest. But deep down she knew that his eye had begun to rove, and she did not believe that she had the charm or guile to keep him riveted to her. As she grew to trust me more, Sherry revealed other facets of Mustafa's character. She was not allowed to visit her parents. Sherry's mother smuggled clothes, through mutual friends, for her granddaughter, Amma. When I asked her why she was banned from meeting her parents, Sherry replied, "He says that my family abuses its relationship with him. They get things done by telling people that their son-in-law was the governor." This type of behavior was common in Pakistan. Powerful men spawn opportunistic relatives, and Sherry came from a family that could never aspire to the heights that her husband had achieved. But Sherry's stones sounded too fantastic to believe, and I wondered if she was exaggerating. The Mustafa I was coming to know was a gracious and rational man. I could speak my mind in front of him. I could tell him what I thought about a given issue, and, to my pleasure, he carefully considered and often accepted my views. I believed that Mustafa was desperately searching for a companion who could challenge him, rather than indulge his whims. I found myself thinking more and more about this misunderstood man who had become entangled with all the wrong women. I came to view myself as the elusive companion whom he was so desperately seeking. The force of my mother's legacy was surfacing in my daily life. Without actually being aware of it, I was emulating much of what I had learned under her rule. I dressed like her. I styled my hair in the same fashion as she had done. Even my relationship with Ains echoed her voice. The misgivings I had experienced prior to my marriage had proved correct. I now viewed my husband as inconsequential. Try as I might, I had no faith in his abilities and little respect for his intellect. I felt that he lacked the necessary drive and ambition to enhance his career, and I was constantly badgering him and questioning his decisions. And yet I did not want a marriage like my parents. I needed a strong man who could manage his own professional life without my interference. I was also thinking of how inadequate a person I had become in my mother's eyes that represented the entire world to me. I was weakened by my attachment to Ains, because he carried no weight to strengthen me. Mother treated us with the same contempt that she had treated me. My mind was in a turmoil. I began to imagine that Ains would be far more suited to a woman like Sherry, and that the chemistry that Mustafa and I could combine would be unstoppable. No words were spoken, yet there was obvious electricity between us. Mustafa was observing me, making sure that this time his choice was right. Sometimes the lack of an overt advance upset and confused me. I felt nervous and a trifle guilty. How could I countenance such a situation? Had anyone else noticed what I was feeling? Did Ains know? Did Mustafa even know? The women in our circle did not seem to look beyond their raised noses. They chatted endlessly about disobedient servants, clothes, jeweler, and interior decorations. Occasionally they spoke about their children, about the horrible state of the schools in Pakistan, and of their dreams to send their sons and daughters abroad for a proper education. Many a day in the lives of these women was almost completely devoted to the topic of what to wear that evening. No different, I now dressed for Mustafa. I had been raised to operate on the principle that appearances are paramount. I sampled all the clothes that had been gathering dust in my wardrobe, exploiting, in particular, the French chiffon saris from my trousseau. I was flattered when Mustafa noticed, and upset when he did not. Picnics and shikar became a part of our lives. On the outskirts of Lahore, near the Indian border, is a fertile hunting preserve. We would pile into jeeps with lots of snacks for the journey, then find a flat, clear spot to pitch our tents and light fires. We women sat around the fires as the men hunted, assisted by local beaters, who made loud bird noises to flush out the partridge from the long grass along the bank of the Ravi River. Mosquitoes, flies, and a variety of other insects added to the melee. The area was rich with migratory duck, waterfowl, quail, partridge, and also wild boar, the eating of which is prohibited by Islam. These would be left to the locals to sell. The night fires kept away the winged predators and the cold. Local marisis, professional singers, sang to the beat of the dolki. The men exchanged stories of the day's shoot as the women concentrated on the music. Against this backdrop, Mustafa seemed always to be trying to impress me, but the seduction was subtle. When he returned from the hunt, he sought my approval by showing off his bag. He looked very attractive with his khaki trousers tucked into his Wellingtons, with his rifle in one hand and a Maui cap on his head. I happened upon him early one morning, just as he was bending down to the waters of a lake to retrieve a wild duck that he had shot. The sun's first rays etched his profile. He looked up, and straight at me my heart skipped a beat. Mustafa was an excellent chef. The meat had to be young, and it could not be overcooked lest it lose its flavor and nutritional value. He was a perfectionist in his art. He prepared a partridge with meticulous care. Amid this motley crowd, I mused, Mustafa and I were two intermeshing spirits. We were both loners who felt misunderstood. Ours, I decided, were artistic souls, struggling to find a cause to which we could commit ourselves. Both of us were searching for someone who could understand the turmoil in our hearts and minds. Something told me that we were fated for one another. I wanted to help him dismantle the facade of ruthlessness and callousness that had been erected by the superficial perceptions of people who did not know the real Mustafa Khar. What amazed me and what I admired most about him was his total disregard for public opinion, especially so since images and public opinions had always been so important to my family. He had the courage to be outrageous if he felt that his position was right. Mustafa did not give a damn about conventions, and I believed that only extraordinary men possessed such a trait. He was a natural leader who, having decided upon a course of action, blazed a new trail in that direction. As a rule, politicians are circumspect, especially in their private lives. Yet Mustafa's marriages and divorces were known in the bazaars and alleys of the countryside, and he did not care. Whatever mud was flung at him slithered off. The people seemed to have balanced his political acumen against his romantic interludes and concluded that the former was more significant. We fell in love under a million stars. We both sensed it, but Mustafa postponed the moment and prolonged the foreplay. When would he make his move? I wondered. Would he make his move? It was an Eid dinner, the feast celebrating the end of Ramadan, the holy month of fasting. The setting was an old mansion, built during British rule. It had a marvelous ballroom with sprung floors and old cut glass chandeliers. The ball was hosted by the Khan Bahadur of Badrash's son. Aunts and I attended as part of Mustafa's entourage. I dressed for the evening, with particular care. Mustafa approached me with measured, determined steps. He believed in body language. He understood that a masculine bearing exuding confidence can make most people crumble. He had perfected the art. He could achieve his will by the sheer force of his posture. That night, he appeared very dapper in a steel grey suit, light blue shirt and black crocodile shoes. He asked me to dance. My eyes demurred. What would aunts think? Suddenly Mustafa imperiously ordered Sherry to dance with aunts. Aunts was flattered by the supreme compliment that a feudal lord would allow his wife to dance with another man. He escorted Sherry to the floor and indicated that I should not refuse Mustafa. I had waited 8 months for this moment. Anticipation quietly merged with a tingling uncertainty. I was sure that the diamond ticker dangling on my forehead took on an extra measure of sparkle. The band was playing Strangers in the Night. Mustafa trespassed with great confidence, and I found myself unable and unwilling to resist. After only a few moments, he led me toward the edge of the dance floor and whispered bluntly, "Will you marry me?" Stunned by the suddenness of the advance, I mumbled, but, I'm already married." "Leave it to God," he said. All too soon I became aware of the other couples in the room and imagined that everyone had heard this exchange. I felt myself blushing. I broke away from Mustafa's grasp, in the midst of the dance, to catch my breath. He walked me back to my chair, appearing nervous, but also quite relieved that he had finally unburdened himself. Now, try as I might, I was totally under Mustafa's spell. He would telephone me, and we would talk for hours over the phone. I became convinced that my future was with Mustafa, and that my marriage to Ains was over. We met as frequently as we could, often at a prefabricated cabin within the compound of the large house that he was having built. Mustafa used the cabin as his den of iniquity. Common sense vanished along with caution, morality and decency. My emotions overwhelmed me. Theoretically, under the Hudud Ordinance, a woman could be stoned for adultery in Pakistan. But that is not the reality. The Quran states that 4 witnesses to the actual penetration must be present, or that one of the participants must publicly confess. At any rate, I was not concerned for my life. In my heightened emotional state, I felt it had only just begun. Bhutto and Mustafa kept up an appearance of friendship, although their relationship was marked by cold formality. Astute observers noticed the gulf between them, but many others believed that Bhutto's apparent hostility toward Mustafa was an act. The term Nora Kushti, fixed wrestling match, was bandied about. As a result, Mustafa's followers remained loyal to him, and Hanif Rami, the new chief minister, found it difficult to win support in the Punjab. Rami went on the attack against Mustafa, feeding the press trumped-up stories of the ex-governor's escapades. For example, they distorted Mustafa's role in intervening in an abduction case, and used the incident to portray him as a badmash, sex fiend. Wives and daughters of the Punjab were told to fear the time that Mustafa Khar would return. And, indeed, he did return. After a sojourn in the political wilderness, Mustafa was reinstated as governor of the Punjab in 1975, but Rami retained the more powerful post of chief minister, at least for the time being. Bhutto placed Mustafa on 3 months probation. If Mustafa acceded to Bhutto's wishes, he would again become chief minister. Mustafa was back in power, proclaiming that Bhutto would never have reinstated him had the slanders against him been true. Ains and I drove to the huge gates of the governor's house where Mustafa was to be sworn in. They were manned by white uniformed armed guards, their high, starched turbans bearing testimony to the everlasting influence of the British Raj. After confirmation of our identities and much checking of our invitation card, we were motioned inside. The car turned into a sweeping driveway, in front of which stood one of the most impressive architectural relics of colonial rule. The white building had been conceived by a former governor, Sir Robert Montgomery, as if possessed by a desire to impose the architectural will of the Raj on Lahore. It lay amid 300 acres of gardens with a lake, weeping willows, aviaries, tennis courts and cypress-lined walks laid out for the private delectation of India's masters. The house had dozens of teak-panelled, high-ceilinged guest suites. Ains and I walked into the famous banquet room known as Darbar Court Hall. This grand room, the central feature of the mansion, could seat more than 500 guests. On the walls hung portraits of the lords and masters of the Punjab, on whose smallest gesture the destiny of millions depended. All around the building were balconies where a Scottish piper strutted up and down playing tunes from the faraway Scottish Highlands. Throngs of people offered congratulations to Sherry before we were silenced by the entry of the new governor and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. I was emotionally distraught. As Mustafa placed his hand on the Quran to take the oath of office, his eyes met mine. He noticed my discomfort and my insecurity. Later in the day, he told me that no government position could take precedence over his love for me. He proved this statement with his actions. Mustafa was an indiscreet lover, It was almost as if he wanted Shelley, Ains, indeed the world, to find out about us. He called one day and said he wanted to see me at once, and was coming over. But how, I asked, Ains is at home. Don't worry, he assured me. 2 minutes later the phone rang again. Ains took the call and listened carefully. After he hung up, he smiled at me and announced, I have to go to the governor's house. Mustafa wants to see me. The governor needs to talk to me. He left immediately. When Ains arrived at the governor's house, Mustafa met him with the news that he had to rush off on urgent business, and told him to swim in the pool and await his return. Mustafa's friend Ralph Khan provided a pair of bathing trunks and stayed with Ains in the pool, guarding the unsuspecting prey. Mustafa and I were still together, when Ralph Khan called from the governor's house and reported, Sir, we can't keep him in the water any longer. He'll pass out with exhaustion. He looks cold and bothered. Let him out in 5 minutes, Mustafa said. Tell him I've just called, I'll be there in 15 minutes. Mustafa hung up the phone and we collapsed in math. Of course I felt an underlying guilt. Cheating on a man was an unnatural situation for me. Ains was good-natured and innocent. I often felt torn and sorry for him. However, on this occasion I was entering a new phase, and Ains was becoming distanced from the way I saw my future. Matters of state beckoned. Mustafa was off with Bhutto on a tour of the Punjab, and I was left in limbo with Ains in Lahore. Wherever they travelled, the two politicians were met with banners such as Mustafa Khar Zindabad, Long live Mustafa Khar, and Shir-e Punjab Zindabad, Long live the Lion of the Punjab. At an appearance at the holy shrine of the Saint Data Gangbakhsh, Mustafa noticed how Bhutto's face paled as the huge crowds thronged about the governor. The Prime Minister was clearly chagrined. Meanwhile, I seized the opportunity to reassess my turbulent, double life. I decided to take my daughter Tanya on a visit to a relative in Kasol, in the interior of the Punjab, to get away from the intrigue. I wanted a place that would be inaccessible to Mustafa, to see if I could live without him, and Kasol was ideal. There were no telephones and no electricity. A part of me also wanted to challenge Mustafa and his stated commitment to me. Would he miss me? Would he follow? When Mustafa returned to Lahore, he was frustrated to learn that I had left. Acting quickly, he ordered a driver to take his official Mercedes 500 SEL to Ankara and await the arrival of his aeroplane there. He assigned Ralph Khan to a covert task. He was to send Ains on a top-secret mission to Peshawar, to take delivery of a fictitious, for your eyes only, letter. Ralph was to take Ains to the airport and make certain that he boarded the flight to Peshawar and that the plane took off. Ains was told to remain in Peshawar until the letter was ready. Mustafa then instructed his pilot to fly into Ankara. There, he took command of the Mercedes and sped towards me in Kasol. The poor inhabitants of this godforsaken hamlet were amazed and impressed when the governor of the Punjab arrived unannounced. Wide-eyed people crowded the alleys and narrow lanes. I was inside my relative's house when I heard the sounds of a siren and an approaching car. Moments later, the cane blind covering the front door of this little farmhouse lifted to reveal Mustafa in his safari suit and Maui cap, silhouetted in the light. He grinned mischievously. He stepped into the house and proclaimed, "You have to come back to Lahore now. I can't live without you." I was shocked by his arrival, though secretly I had longed for it. I made the excuses necessary to cover up an extramarital relationship. In retrospect, they seemed unbelievable. The governor of the Punjab was a friend of my husband, I said, and Ains had requested that he come to bring me home. It was a transparent ruse, but my relatives were basking in the glow of a visit from the governor, and showed no sign of suspicion. I could not just run from the house. This was the countryside, where respectable women cover themselves. I fashioned a makeshift chador, face and body covering, from a white bed sheet and wrapped it around my head and face, leaving only my eyes visible. Mustafa, my baby, her nanny and I left together in the Mercedes. Mustafa drove expertly, at speeds approaching 100 miles per hour, until we reached Okara. Then we flew back to Lahore. There, as we had discussed on the plane, Mustafa entered an official car and Tanya, the nanny and I stepped into another, with darkly tinted windows. We drove to the governor's house escorted by a phalanx of motorcycles, with their sirens blaring. The national press picked up the story of Mustafa's surprise visit to Kasol and portrayed the governor as a benevolent public servant, eager to show his concern for the hinterlands. No one knew that he was simply after a woman. Tanya, her nanny and I were installed in the presidential suite of the governor's house. Mustafa joined me for dinner, with an impish smile on his face. But I was nervous. Ains was away in Peshawar, cooling his heels, but what if Sherry found out that I was under her very own roof? Mustafa told me not to worry. He had told Sherry that he was downstairs entertaining the ulama, a group of religious men. There was no question of a female being present, so Sherry would remain in the private wing of the official residence. Late that evening, after Mustafa left me to return to his wife, I found it difficult to sleep. I woke early. The nanny dressed Tanya and we left for Bourne. Shortly after we left, Sherry noticed that an inordinate amount of milk had been used the day before, and she accused the servants of pilfering it. They pleaded innocence, and explained that the little baby had consumed it. "Whose baby?" Sherry asked. The servants did not know my name, but with one sentence they changed the course of my life. The Begum Sahib with the long brown hair. Now Sherry knew. She confronted Mustafa, who coolly admitted that he was in love with me. For nothing changed. Everything changed. Mustafa and Sherry continued as governor and first lady of the Punjab. Our trysts became more frequent and very brazen. Passionate emotions encouraged total recklessness. I was carried along on their wave. At the same time I hated being an unfaithful wife to a decent man. But Mustafa's romance and personality blotted out the wrongness of it all, and colored everything with expectations of a perfect relationship. It was terribly traumatic because I was a one-man woman and felt unclean. Mustafa called me 3 or 4 times daily, and professed misery if he did not see me at least once a day. I learned to trot out excuses for being away from home. Mustafa was an incurable romantic. Once, at 3 a.m., the ring of the telephone awakened me. Ains was sleeping soundly at my side. Sensing whom it might be, I quickly slid out of bed and picked up the phone that was just outside the bedroom. "Tina, I'm dying to see you," Mustafa's voice pleaded. "But you can't," I whispered. "I can't see you now. I can't live without you. I want to give up everything and be with you." "Mustafa, it's late. I can't speak to you, Ains." "Don't put down the phone," he interrupted. "I'm going to drive past your house in 10 minutes. Go to your window and stand there. Just for 1 minute, I want to see you." Quietly I replaced the receiver and tiptoed back into the bedroom. Ains stirred and I told him that the call was a wrong number. Moments later, he drifted back to sleep and I slipped out of the room. I stood at the window in my nightdress and soon the headlights of the Mercedes came into view. I smiled into the darkness, then drew the curtains. A certain bitterness crept into our relationship, caused by my status as a married woman. Mustafa began to cringe at any mention of Ains. Without actually mentioning the word, he was pushing me towards divorce. He wanted me to make the decision, as proof of my love for him. I wavered, reluctant to hurt Ains, and worried about that. Social consequences for my parents and unmarried sisters, my brother's honor, Ains and his family's disgrace. At social functions, Mustafa's provocative looks, and his comments, became bolder and very obvious. Ains avoided the signals, but the women in our group stared daggers at me. I felt as if a sudden chill had descended. I tried not to break down and thus confirm the gossip. I was very glad that my parents were living in London, so that my mother would not hearty rumors that her daughter had become an adulteress. Led by Sherry, the women decided that silence did not hurt enough, so they began to taunt me. They spoke loudly, to one another, aware that I was listening about a hypothetical married woman involved with a married man. With their looks and their acid tongues, they enforced the Hudud ordinance, symbolically stoning me. For a time, Ains and I stopped attending the banquets. Ains knew that our friendship was now established and accepted the various excuses I gave for not wanting to go. But soon our disappearance from the social scene was noted. Mustafa called me and asked, "What's the problem? Why are you staying away?" I told him that the gossip and mockery had become too humiliating and that my conscience could not justify my position as the other woman. I said that I no longer felt able to cope with the situation. Mustafa was incensed. He demanded total loyalty from these people. They had no right to champion Sherry. He expected them to respect his choices and decisions without question. "I'll take care of it," he said. "Everything will be fine." The very next day I was startled to find Sherry at my door, with her friend Cuckoo at her side. I invited them into the privacy of my bedroom, but all three of us were visibly uncomfortable. Eye contact was difficult. Sherry was upset, but she delivered her rehearsed lines. "I know about you," she said. "I accept it. I know my husband and you are in love. He wants you to come to our dinners. I will not resent your presence. Nor will the other women." Cuckoo nodded to confirm this. I was very embarrassed and could think of no response. I felt like a slut. Sherry had delivered the message as Mustafa commanded, but now she launched into an impassioned speech. "Listen," she stressed, "I'm here because Mustafa sent me, but I've come under duress. I want to save my marriage. I don't want you to see him again. If you do, I'll have no choice but to commit suicide." She pleaded with me, "Get out of my life. Get out of his life. He's a very difficult man. I know him. You don't know him. He's no good for you. He'll ruin your life as he's ruined mine." She tried to convince me that Mustafa was a violent and dangerous man. She claimed that he beat her savagely. For trivial reasons, if she forgot to tell the servants to switch on the hot water, if she misplaced something, if she delayed having his clothes pressed. The stories were bizarre. Quite simply, I could not believe them, and Sherry could surely see the doubt in my eyes. I looked beyond the stories at a very extraordinary, charming but misunderstood man. Perhaps I chose to bury my head in the sand. I rationalized his countless marriages. To me, Mustafa was loving, gentle and, above all, reasonable. And yet I knew that such things did occur in our society far more frequently than anyone wished to admit. I knew that this was the routine manner in which most feudal lords treated their women. The most unsettling part of the conversation was that I sympathized with Sherry's position, and could understand the pain that these disclosures, whether real or imagined, caused her. I countered by asking why, if Mustafa was such a demon, she was fighting so hard to hold him. "I'm determined to keep this marriage," she vowed. "I can handle it. I have to survive. If I try to leave, you'll take my daughter away. I can't live without her or leave her to a life with him. I've adjusted to his life now. I want to be settled. There's no meaning to life without him. He has got into my system. You must help me by getting out of his life. Please." This statement also rang true. A Pakistani woman will endure almost anything in order to hold a marriage together. In our society, marriage may be purgatory, but divorce is hell. Despite my love for Mustafa, I found myself wavering. Sherry was in love with him, and yet she hated him, I thought. I struggled with my conscience. I desperately wanted to do the honorable thing. Late that night I decided, it had to end. I would not see Mustafa anymore. I would sacrifice him. But at the same time a quiet, more powerful inner voice was mocking me. A voice that was saying I want to be the one he chooses. I called Mustafa and told him that I intended to end the relationship. We're going to hurt too many people, I said. He was involved in political business and his attention was diverted elsewhere, but he said that he would get back to me soon. I spent the next few days vacillating. I had done the right thing. Why was I so unhappy? 4 days passed. Then Mustafa arrived at my door, with Sherry at his side. She must have been broken and beaten, but she spoke her lines with conviction. She pleaded with me to return to their social scene. Mustafa was using his wife to court his lover. Was this a sign of how deeply he loved me, or was it evidence of the type of perverse behavior that Sherry tried to warn me about? I pushed the nagging doubts aside and the darker, selfish side of me smiled inwardly at the victory. And I re-entered the social circuit. The hostility was muted, but it was still in evidence, particularly during that inevitable part of the evening when the women separated from the men. Sherry often held court on these occasions. Discussing her perfect relationship with Mustafa, she laced her conversation with barbs, such as, Mustafa says women who have affairs with married men are sluts. Such words were met with sniggers and nudges, all directed at me. At one dinner, the wives of 2 of Pakistan's leading industrialists made several sarcastic remarks that reduced me to tears of humiliation. Mustafa was furious when I told him, and promised to teach them a lesson. The following day he summoned the husbands of the 2 women to the governor's house and dictated, I want your wives to go to Tehmina and apologize today. If they don't, I won't take it lightly. You'll pay the price for their insults. You can go now. Within a matter of hours, the 2 women appeared at my home and issued the required apologies. Sherry was made more distraught than ever by these developments, and she decided to go to Mecca for Umrah, the Muslim religious pilgrimage. Mustafa and I used the opportunity to spend much of our time together. I saw him alone during the day. In the evenings, he entertained Ains and me, along with other friends, at dinner. I enjoyed the extra time with Mustafa, but remained frightened by the realization of Sherry's proximity to Allah and my growing disregard for his commands. Sherry returned, exuding holiness and calm. It was obvious what she had prayed for and I felt unclean and exposed. I worried that God would answer her prayers. But instead, for his own mysterious reasons, God answered mine. Perhaps it was his way of exacting retribution. Everyone seemed to know about our illicit relationship, including my in-laws. Poor Ains continued to dismiss the talk as malicious gossip. News of our romance spread all the way to my mother in London. With the word scandal blazing in her mind, she flew to Pakistan for a heart-to-heart talk with Ains, warning him of the rumors. Stop meeting this man, she said, if you don't, you'll lose your wife. Ains told my mother. I'll see whomever I want to see. I'm not afraid. My mother was furious. What kind of a husband are you? She asked. My daughter met you while still in her school uniform. What she's becoming now is your responsibility. Her father gave her protection. Now you're exposing her to a man as disreputable as Khar. She shook her head at him and said, "I knew it would never work. You can't control her." Ains was not the last to know, he simply chose not to know. I felt a glimmer of respect for Ains. It was the first time I had seen him demonstrate the backbone necessary to stand up to my mother. It was a paradox. He stood his ground, but the ground he was standing on was quicksand. When Ains left for a week of business in Singapore, Tanya and I accompanied him on the first leg of his journey, to Karachi. Soon after Ains left us, Mustafa arrived on the pretext of official business. He invited me to dinner with his old friend and political ally, Mustafa Khar, who was Chief Minister of Sindh, the southern province. On the afternoon prior to the dinner, a friend had dropped by to see me, and warned me that Mustafa's love was only superficial. "He just loves you because you look good," she charged. "You dress well. You're good for his image. Once he sees you with curlers or with night cream slapped on your face, he won't love you. He likes the package, not the reality." I was curious to find out if this could be true. I decided to put Mustafa to the test. That night I walked into the official residence of the Chief Minister of Sindh looking like Bo Peep. I wore a light blue, checked gingham dress with absurd puffed sleeves and 3 layers of frills trailing at my ankles. The yoke in front had yet more frills. The dress had a plastic sticker on it depicting a pastoral scene of a cottage and a long-tailed cow. Mustafa was in the bedroom when I arrived, and I went to meet him there. He appeared very dashing in a finely tailored black suit. His eyes were lowered as he knotted his tie, but when he looked up at me his face fell. "What the hell is this?" he said. My self-confidence immediately evaporated. It was too late to turn back. With an expression of disgust and resignation, he escorted me to dinner. Beautiful older, sophisticated women with enticingly deep cleavages and flashing navels revealed beneath exotic saris stared at me. I felt completely out of my league. The sound of rustling chiffon mocked me. Mustafa dumped me for the evening. He circulated among the other women, and made a point of flirting with the most attractive of them. A few men came up to me and ventured words of polite conversation, but they moved on quickly, having fulfilled the duties of etiquette. I stood around with a glass of Coca-Cola held to my chest, trying desperately to hide the cow's tail. No matter which angle I tilted the glass, I could not cover it completely. In my nervousness I spilled the drink all over my Bo Peep dress. Humayun Beg Mohammed, who ironically owned the local Coca-Cola franchise, came to my rescue. He led me to the bathroom, where I washed out the stain. Then I stood in Jatoy's bedroom, alone for what seemed like eternity, hugging the air conditioner, praying for my dress not only to dry, but to evaporate. Cinderella needed a fairy godmother, but she did not appear. Eventually I slipped back into the party, still wet and very embarrassed. Mustafa asked one of his friends to drive me home. That night I held my eyes out. My friend had been right, Mustafa did only love me for my appearance. He called the next morning. When I told him that my outfit had been a test, he asked, "Why do you do these things? You embarrassed yourself more than me. I love you as a person. You are a very gracious woman. You look ridiculous when you try to act undignified. Don't go around accepting stupid challenges. I love you for what you are. Why must you change? If you become a completely different person, I might change my mind. Do you understand?" I whimpered, "Yes." He cemented his point when he turned the tables. "Look," he said, "if I came to pick you up dressed like a joker or a clown, would you accept it?" "Never. You'd feel embarrassed, so don't be silly. Be yourself." The dinner party was significant for another, more important reason. Everyone had noticed my presence, how could they not, and Karachi was abuzz with fresh rumors. What was a beautiful young woman of my background doing in the company of Mustafa Khar when her husband was away in Singapore? Upon his return, Ains heard about this, and at last confronted me. I could not lie to him. I decided that putting him out of his misery was the only way to quash my own. I confessed everything, and asked for a divorce. Marrying Mustafa was not the relevant issue. I could not live with a man whom I had betrayed, whom I did not respect, and who did not hold my interest. Ains was very civilized, even in this moment of crisis. He told me that he would grant the divorce. All he wanted from me was custody of Tanya. I need her, he said. She's all I have. She will remind me of the woman I love. You can get her by going to the courts. Islamic law allows the mother custody of children prior to puberty, but please leave her with me until I get over your loss. I'll be desolate without both of you. That's all I ask for. I was moved by the speech, and remembered what a good person and devoted father poor Ains was. At the same time, Ains would have disintegrated with both of us gone. I knew that Tanya would make him feel the loss less. I wished to remove nothing more from him than myself. I also knew that in time he would heal and would be decent enough to return Tanya to me. It was simpler breaking my own heart than breaking his already broken one again. I felt that of the two of us, I was the stronger. I could withstand the loss more easily than he. I agreed. Mother was livid, father was furious. Once more mother flew in from London, determined to prove that my infatuation with Mustafa was due to some form of mental derangement. She arranged for Dr. Harun, Karachi's most eminent psychiatrist, to pay me a visit and more or less demanded that he diagnose me as insane. If she could not convince me that my actions were the result of mental instability, perhaps the good doctor could. This was a variation on an old theme. Ever since my childhood meningitis, mother had sought to explain away all my rebellion as madness. Before the consultation, she took me aside and warned, "Don't tell him everything." Her message was implicit. If there had been a physical relationship with Mustafa, I was not to divulge it. After one extended session, during which the psychiatrist did, indeed, discern the truth, he declared to my mother that I was disappointingly normal, and he singled out the cause of my fall. Mustafa Khar is a professional seducer. Your daughter is a victim. This only partially appeased her. By this definition I was not a complete slut, but she proclaimed that Mustafa would not have attempted to seduce me unless and until I had transmitted the message that I was available. Thus I was culpable for the misfortune that smeared my, and the family's, reputation. You had availability in your eyes, mother charged. A man with a track record like Mustafa Khar clearly does not approach decent women. The kind of women he is attracted to are the kind who become kept women and mistresses. None of my other daughters would have been approachable. Mother now concentrated her efforts on damage control. I found myself passive and acquiescent guilty. I reverted to the status of a little girl and bowed to parental authority and economic reality, for my parents were my only source of financial support. My mind was too jumbled to make independent plans. Whatever little personality I had developed, I now lost. Mother sent me back to Lahore to live under the surveillance of my grandmother. I was not allowed to go anywhere on my own, nor was I allowed to make or receive telephone calls. I could not meet my friends. Mentally, I felt at a dead end. Mustafa was a more than taboo subject and, in any case, he was still married and heavily involved in politics. I became an outcast even in my own eyes. Public perception was obviously different from what I had intended. Discarding Tanya was how the situation was perceived by people who had no idea of my reasons for behaving this way. That and my scandalous reputation and divorce sank my confidence to rock bottom. I fell quite naturally into the old pattern of following mother's orders. In my more lucid moments, I prayed for divine intervention. I was moved to my father's family home in the northwest frontier, which is truly like America's Wild West, and placed under the control of my father's elder brother. Here, I lived amongst my simple Pathan relatives, where speaking of being in love or divorce was completely taboo. Even the women avoided letting me indulge. I either slept or listened to music all day in my room. One day, Ains was allowed to visit me. At first, his presence made me feel very guilty, but when he began to haggle over custody of our possessions, I began to view him in another light. He asked him to sign a document signing that I had sold all my belongings to him for a specified sum, which he would, of course, never pay. I signed, and found that a portion of my guilt was washed away. I thought how little it took to make some men heal. Before he left, Ains promised to send Tanya to me. After a suitable period I was released from confinement, but only after my parents were convinced that I was no longer reformable and would carry on relations with Mustafa Khar from their London residence if they took me there, thereby contaminating their home and setting a bad example for my younger sisters, one that would affect their marriage prospects. They decided to withdraw from my life. My mother said, "She's a black sheep. If she has stooped to Mustafa Khar's level, she cannot rise again." to ours. They broke off contact with me. I left for Karachi so that Tanya could return to me, start school and be near her father. I rented a tiny apartment, just big enough for Tanya, her nanny and me, and took a job working in the office of a construction company owned by my friend, Farooq Hassan. He and his wife were among the few who were very gracious and supportive. In truth, the job was merely a favor, created to help me during this difficult time. I redecorated the office and spent the morning hours drinking cappuccino and breakfasting on fried eggs and baked beans on toast. I spent hours on the telephone talking to my friends and freely used the services of the office driver to take me wherever I wanted to go. Occasionally Farooq Hassan entered the office and interrupted me on the telephone, reminding me to make a business call. When that was finished, I resumed my routine. The driver fetched Tanya from school and brought her to join me for lunch. Afterwards, I spent some time shopping or reading magazines until the close of the business day. For this grueling labor I was paid 1,500 rupees, about £34, a month. Very quickly I became aware of my new substatus. A divorcee in Pakistani society is always a prime target for malicious gossip. Wagging tongues and leering glances turned me into a recluse. I spent most of my time either at home or in the office. Mustafa was never available. A political storm was brewing, with him in its midst. He had grown increasingly agitated with Bhutto. In Mustafa's view, his mentor had strayed from his commitment to the people. He had isolated himself from the source of his power, the common man, and was now surrounded by cronies and quislings. When Mustafa once more resigned as governor of the Punjab, I concluded that he was truly a man of honor. He had decided to give up all the perks of high office in order to maintain his ideals. In 1975 Mustafa wished to stand in a by-election for the provincial parliament. Pakistan was now divided into 5 provinces. Provincial legislatures had become operative under the 193 constitution. Bhutto, realizing the problems Mustafa would create in the Punjab Assembly, refused to sanction his candidacy. Instead, to get him out of the way, he offered him the ambassadorship to the United States. The break between the two former friends was now in the open. Mustafa resigned from the People's Party, announcing that as many as 40 members of parliament would follow and form the core group of a new party. But only a few members rallied to his cause, known as the Khar loyalists. Many of them were arrested and imprisoned at the dreaded Dalai camp. Nevertheless, Mustafa persisted in an independent run for the provincial assembly, capitalizing upon a slowly rising wave of anti-Bhutto sentiment. The masses were disillusioned by the failure of Bhutto's promises of prosperity, and Mustafa articulated their thoughts for them. His words of criticism rang true. After all, he had once been the Prime Minister's closest associate. Bhutto panicked and sent a brigade of People's Party functionaries to campaign against Mustafa. He was shaken by Mustafa's opposition, and was heard referring to him as Brutus. As the election neared, Bhutto's people played ditty. During a Mustafa rally in Tajpura, Bhutto henchmen released poisonous snakes in the midst of a crowd of 100,000 people. A stampede resulted and many people were trampled. Gunshots were reported. Mustafa returned from that meeting shaken and disturbed. One of his loyalists, Sajid, a member of the National Assembly, brought the body of a young man to Mustafa's house, cradling in his arms tile evidence of Bhutto's ruthlessness. He suggested that if Mustafa led the funeral procession, the entire Punjab would take to the streets in his support. But Mustafa was not interested in seizing the opportunity to publicize the atrocity. Instead, he screamed at Sajid, "Are you mad? Why have you brought the body here? Don't you know that I could be hauled up for murder?" Sajid turned away sadly. It was a time of great unrest. Trade unions in various cities were protesting against high prices, low wages, and non-existent social security. A popular trade union leader was killed the following day by police, which led to some bloody scenes in the Punjab. When Mustafa went to console the family and to announce that he would, indeed, lead the funeral procession, he was assaulted by militant workers and had to be rescued by the police. He thought it politically unfeasible and sought to back out of his commitment, but realized that it would be difficult to do so without losing face. He and his advisors hatched a scheme. That evening, Mustafa and Chaudhry Hanif, a member of the provincial parliament, were driven secretly to Salcott. Meanwhile, Sherry played her role, making frantic telephone calls, finally managing to get through to Bhutto himself. "Where is my husband?" she screamed at Bhutto. "You've killed him, I know. Where is he?" The innocent Bhutto did not know. From Salcott, Mustafa and his companions started back to Lahore on foot. They reached a wayside cafe, where Mustafa was immediately recognized by the proprietor, who rushed to the authorities for help. Thus rescued, Mustafa was driven back to Lahore. The morning newspapers carried the incredible story that Mustafa Khar had been kidnapped, and the clear inference was that Bhutto's people were behind the deed. Mustafa staged a press conference where he declared, "I am a shikari, hunter. I did not know where I was, but I found my way back home by looking at the stars." Mustafa joined the Conservative Muslim League so that he would have the protection of a party platform, changing political colors like a chameleon. I thought this was a mistake. He was now Bhutto's #1 enemy. He was under constant surveillance by the intelligence agencies, dodging arrest and incarceration. There was no way that he could risk making contact with me. I had been living in Karachi for 5 months when I learned that Sherry was pregnant. I also heard that Mustafa had developed a relationship with a singer. Angry and humiliated, I managed to reach Mustafa on the phone. He protested his innocence in both matters, but I did not believe him. The pain was too great to ignore. I told him that I had finally decided to break all contact with him. It was over. 5 more months passed in loneliness, anguish and insecurity. Finally, craving forgiveness, I left for Mecca to perform Umrah, as Sherry had done earlier. Standing there before the house of God, I half prayed, half cried. "Oh God, I don't want to be known as a fast woman. I have strayed. I seek your forgiveness. Give me strength to restore my honor. My relationship with the man was cheap. Please show me the right path. Stop these loose tongues from wagging. Stop these figures from pointing at me." The revelation came to me. The only way to restore my marred reputation was to marry the man. It was the only honorable course of action. Mustafa Khar had branded me for the rest of my life. I was condemned to the lowly position of a mistress, which is what men like Mustafa had, apart from his respectable wife. If I could even find someone else to marry me, the man would taunt me whenever he was reminded of the stigma on my soul. I had no choice. Society would never accept me unless I became Mustafa's wife. Even my parents would not accept me unless I improved my status. Mustafa was a man who would command my mother's respect. He was not somebody she could push around, his sheer presence did not permit it. My marriage to him was my only salvation now. I prayed to God, asking him to make this miracle happen. Sherry's pregnancy disturbed me, yet explained her effort to keep him. Although I understood her situation, I was overwhelmed by my own messed up life. There seemed no other way to redeem my honor. I also believed that Mustafa would not remain with Sherry, no matter how many pregnancies she had. Almost at the very moment I returned to Karachi from Mecca, Mustafa called. He said he was flying in to see me. He arrived at an house hidden in the boot of a car, so as to shake off surveillance. I found the fact that the mighty Mustafa Khar would fold himself into such a position for me incredibly flattering. He asked me to marry him immediately. He said that he would not take no for an answer. I'm going back to Lahore, he said. You get there. I'll be waiting. We'll get married straight away. I left Tanya with Ains, promising to return for her in 3 days, and flew to Lahore. Mustafa and I travelled to his home village of Kotadu. On the 25th of July 1976, in complete secrecy, we were married by a trusted mullah. Mustafa held my hand and spoke with great sincerity. Tehmina, you must never fear me. You must talk to me about everything, whenever you want to. I'll always love you and be kind to you. I returned to Karachi to pack, and only then realized how disoriented I was. I was relieved that I was no longer just Mustafa's mistress. But what was to happen now? Our marriage was legal according to the laws of Pakistan and moral according to the Quran, but it was not expedient. Was it to remain a secret until the political environment improved? Would I remain sequestered until Mustafa divorced Sherry? I did not know the answers to these questions, and my tangled mind seemed unable to absorb all that had happened. I knew, however, that Bhutto's cronies would love to hear of Mustafa's latest dalliance. The gutter press would devour this story at a time when Mustafa could ill afford a new scandal. In a panic as to what was to become of me, I made the bitter decision to leave Tanya with Ains until everything was better defined. It was dreadful to have to do this, but I wished to have her with me only when I was sure she would be accepted and loved, and felt she would belong. Over the phone, I arranged the details. Ains was the first to learn of my new marriage, and he was obviously upset. But he agreed to take Tanya back for a time, and return her to me once my life became more settled. I hoped, somewhat misguidedly, as it turned out, that the uncertain situation would last only a few weeks, a month at the most. Mustafa called, complaining that he could not bear to be separated from me. He asked me to speed up my return to Lahore. I agreed. Tanya was sensitive to my sadness. Her wide, dark brown, 3-year-old eyes watched with alarm as I packed all her clothes into several suitcases and placed all her toys into cardboard boxes. Packing the boxes was traumatic for us both, and something neither of us has ever forgotten. As my driver carried Tanya's world out to the car, my baby's lips began to quiver. You are going to see your father, I said, trying to keep my tone bright. I'll be back in just a few days. What was I? An underdeveloped, irresponsible mother, a child? I couldn't say. Tanya loved her father. She visited him every week. But her innocent mind sensed the different nature of this episode. She clung to me quietly throughout the drive. The nanny stood outside Ames's home, awaiting us. I opened the car door. As the nanny arms reached for Tanya, the little girl turned her face away. Her tiny fingers grasped at my clothes. She howled, screaming out her fear with deep despair, such as I had never heard. Through my tears I cried out, "I'll be back soon. Tanya, I'll be back soon." The nanny pulled at Tanya. She tried desperately to cling to me, but I pushed her away. Within moments it was over. Tanya was gone and the car sped off. I could hear her terrified wails grow more faint with distance. I could not look back. As I flew to my second husband in Lahore, the memory of Tanya's cries was heart-wrenching. So were mine. I needed a mother myself. Sitting in the plane, I had no idea just how far I was from her. I never thought she would have to grow up without me. I stared out at the ground far below, and wondered what was to become of us. The sudden appearance of a cloud obscured my view. Mustafa's young aide Sajid met me at the airport, and announced that his house was to be my hideout for the evening. The following day Mustafa drove me to the ancient city of Multan, where I was to in seclusion for several months. About a 2-hour drive from Mustafa's village of Kotadu, Multan is surrounded by sprawling feudal estates, fruit orchards, and rich alluvial soil. The Qurashi and Jilani clans hold sway in this ancient trading center. Originally, the two clans were satraps of the mighty Mughal emperors. Later, most of them found it convenient to transfer their loyalty to the crown, which awarded them vast tracts of land. The city is built around one of the most magnificent Sufi shrines, where, every year, the faithful gather and pay millions of rupees in tribute. The Qurashi and Jilani clans fought for generations for this windfall, and the old feud continues to affect local politics. In this milieu, I tried to set the house in order. I had to keep busy, lest my ache for Tanya took over. Mustafa visited frequently, but his impulsiveness kept me unsettled. Sometimes he left for Lahore, telling me that he was going to be away for a week, yet he would return the very same night. He fought ambivalence. He could not risk exposing our marriage. He could not bear to be away from me. He said that the 6-hour journey between Lahore and Multan was worth the few moments he could spend with me. But he soon tired of the drive. Before long, he moved me back to Lahore, installing me in the prefabricated cabin that was the site of so many of our illicit liaisons. The cabin held many memories for me, both sweet and sour, and living here made me feel uncomfortable. I yearned for legitimacy, and the chance to be reunited with Tanya. Mustafa visited me in the cabin during the day, and then spent the night with his other, still unsuspecting, wife at the main house on the same premises. One evening, after Mustafa had left, I fell asleep. I was startled when he awoke me, and much more startled to see Sherry at his side. He had tried to break the news to his pregnant wife, but Sherry did not believe him, so he had brought her here to prove his confession. The subterfuge was over, and I moved into the big house. Whatever the consequences, our families and associates would now know that Mustafa had 2 wives, although he was determined to keep the information away from the press. My new home was a Spanish-style villa, with a sloping, red brick roof and many arches. The 6 bedrooms were all occupied by Mustafa's relatives, so I moved upstairs to the den. The rumor mill reached my parents in London. They were very upset. Once more their rebel daughter had brought disgrace to their household. They announced that I was dead for them. But our marriage was so easily accepted by the people around Mustafa that I wondered why I had ever been apprehensive. And my grandmother approved. When she came for a visit, I saw fear for my future in her eyes, yet there was also a contentment, a peace brought about by the decent status I had at last achieved. It was comedy, it was tragedy. I wanted to spend all my time with Mustafa, yet I did not want him to neglect Sherry. I was self-conscious when he showed affection to me in front of her. Sometimes at night I pushed Mustafa out of my room and sent him to her. I did not want to hurt Sherry, but her pain was palpable. I could never forget that she was pregnant and therefore doubly humiliated. We attended social engagements as a threesome. Mustafa took this in his stride and Sherry did not seem to mind, but I felt alienated and acutely embarrassed when we entered a house together. To me, we appeared anachronistic in this modern age. I noticed an interesting phenomenon when Mustafa went away on a hunt. I was miserable in his absence, but Sherry was happy that he was gone. As the time for his return approached, I grew happy in anticipation, but Sherry was visibly upset. Sherry opened up to me, more than before, and began to tell me stories that featured Mustafa as a grotesque sadist who derived pleasure from humiliating the ones he professed to love. It was only now that I learned what had happened when Mustafa had divorced Norbahar, and the dreadful way he had treated Safia and her nanny. Once he had discovered that it was not politically expedient to be married to a dancer, he had sent for Norbahar. She sat in front of him, quietly waiting to administer to his wishes. With his feet on his desk, Mustafa had puffed calmly on a cigar and stared at her through the V of his crossed legs. Very directly, he told her that, as things had turned out, she had become a liability to him and that the marriage had to end. In my position, I cannot afford it, he said. Norbahar screamed out her pain at the new governor of the Punjab, but he accepted this with stoicism. She begged him to reconsider, but he refused. Finally, Norbahar stood up, stared directly into her husband's eyes and uttered a curse. Mustafa Khar, may you suffer like you have made me suffer. May you know the pain of being scorned. I pray to God that in every street of this country, your children roam. Every stone you pick up will reveal a child of yours. You shall never be at peace. Her final words burned into his memory, a woman will destroy you like and you have destroyed me. Although Norbahar was gone, the curse lingered. When he had discovered Safia's infidelity, he had, apparently, beaten her without mercy and broken several of her ribs. But, even worse, he had ordered one of the maids to insert red chili powder into the vagina of poor Aisha, the nanny, for not informing him of the affair. Sherry realized that he suffered from an inferiority complex. He resented women from our social background and made it his mission to subjugate them. He disguised his class envy by assuming a feudal air. She claimed that his political idealism was merely an attempt to gain access to our class and that his concern for the poor and downtrodden was a sham. In truth, she said, it was a manifestation of his hatred for the elite. He wanted to demolish the structure that ridiculed his origins and laughed at his lack of breeding and style. Women were his obvious victims. He was out to destroy us. A part of me wrote off such statements as the ravings of a woman scorned, another part of me filed them carefully in my memory. I watched the evidence build. In his dealings with Sherry, Mustafa exhibited extreme impatience. He treated her with contempt and abused her with filthy language that made my ears burn. One morning he asked her for his Pharmaton multivitamins that he ordered specially from London. When she produced a half-empty bottle, Mustafa was furious. "Where are the rest?" he demanded. "I took them," Sherry admitted. "I needed to because of my pregnancy." Mustafa kicked her in the buttocks. He pulled off his thick rubber-soled shoes and struck her with them. Then he roughly pushed her out of the room. I froze in shock, but could not find the courage to express my revulsion. My first experience as the target of Mustafa's wrath came soon after, when I had a dental appointment. Sherry was to take me. I knew that Mustafa was still attempting to keep the news of our marriage out of the papers, so I asked him what name I should use. Begum Mustafa Khar, he replied. When we reached the surgery, I decided that I did not want to humiliate Sherry, so I did not register as Mustafa's wife. I simply called myself Tehmina. Sherry reported to Mustafa that I had disobeyed his instructions. Mustafa interpreted my consideration as betrayal and raged. Never, ever disobey me. You have to do what I tell you to do. On another occasion, I was in my bedroom when Mustafa sent a message that he wanted to see me on the veranda. I was changing my clothes, so it took me a few minutes to comply with his request. When I strolled casually out onto the veranda, I found Mustafa livid. His eyes were bloodshot and bulging out of their sockets. How dare you keep me waiting, he raged. I told you to come immediately. When I send you a message it means that you have to drop everything and obey, I tried to explain, but my words were angrily dismissed. Mustafa and I were sitting in our bedroom when Sherry reported that she had caught 19-year-old Abdurrahman, his son from his first marriage, smoking in the bathroom. Immediately Mustafa summoned Abdurrahman and the servants. Officiously, he asked his son if he had been smoking. The boy lied. Mustafa rose to his feet and ordered the servants to forward the lad to the floor and hold him there, spread-eagled. He began to beat his hapless son with a stick. With each blow the boy screamed for mercy. I cringed at the horrible crack of stick against skin, and at the sight of blood. Mustafa swung it so violently that the stick broke across the boy's back. Undaunted, Mustafa called for another suck, and flailed away until that too broke. He was on his third stick when I could take it no longer. I tried to intervene, but was pushed out of the way. I was petrified and shaken by Mustafa's unreasonable and callous violence toward his own son. That evening we were invited to Tajul Mulk's house. He was an old and trusted friend, and his home held a special feeling. It was here that Mustafa had first proposed marriage. Mustafa asked me to take cash with me. That evening, when the group decided to go out for dinner, Mustafa asked me for money. I explained that I was not used to carrying a bag, and had forgotten. In front of everyone he snapped, "Get in the car, go back home. Pick up the money and come back." I did as he commanded, but I felt very degraded. One day Sherry asked idly if I would leave my foreign clothes for her when I went away, as she could not buy them in Pakistan. I was confused, and asked what she meant. We had no plans to travel outside Pakistan. Sherry was confused too, and explained why she had accepted my presence in the household, with at least a measure of equanimity. Mustafa had told her that he had only married me to save me from all the vicious talk that was going around, and had said that I would only be in the house for a few months, until the muck had settled. After that he would send me abroad and arrange a quiet divorce. Sherry believed him, because he wanted to. Mustafa had taken me along for a shoot when we received word that Sherry had delivered a son. He was thrilled. He visited the mother and child immediately upon our return to Lahore, then brought the child home for his mother to see. She made the baby lick honey, an old custom that is believed will help the child develop the qualities of the person performing the ritual. She lifted her lips to his tiny ear and called the azan 3 times, Allahu Akbar, God is great. Then she said the kalima, La ilaha illallah ala Muhammadur Rasul Allah, there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. Thus was the boy established in the Islamic faith. Mustafa took the infant back to the hospital, but that night he fell ill with pneumonia and died. Vicious rumors circulated that Mustafa was unhappy at the birth of the baby and had killed him. It was not true. I had seen how shaken he was by the boy's death. Also, it did not seem to matter to Mustafa that his children were not born into stable marriages. Mustafa had children in various pockets of the country and he felt no sense of responsibility for them. In his view, the child was a victim of his own fate. Mustafa would have no reason to dispose of him. But once again Mustafa's reputation preceded him. People were quite willing to believe the worst about him. Not unreasonably, this was especially true of Sherry's family, and their animosity caused a final break. Mustafa served Sherry with divorce papers. "Talak, talak, talak," he said, and it was all over. We left the house for Sherry and her mother to take what they wished. The jewelry was worth a fortune and included some 80 sets given to her when she had married Mustafa. The Shah of Iran had presented her with the most exquisite turquoise set. Watches and jewels came from the King of Saudi Arabia. Bhutto's wedding present was a spectacular gift of gold and precious jewels. Sherry packed up everything and moved out. I felt sad that Sherry had had to leave her own home for me, but I also felt relieved. 2 wives together is very medieval and cow-like to me. I began to redecorate the house that was mine now. I removed the thick velvet curtains and went about creating a very Americanized interior. The high ceilings were decorated with intricate designs made with vegetable paints in the traditional colors of Multan, Mustafa's area. Bright orange, green, blue and white complemented the pale furnishings perfectly. I began to train the servants a slice of lemon decorating the Coca-Cola glass, tea served in silver, with a triangular folded paper napkin between cup and saucer. The house became orderly. My mother's training was evident. Mustafa thought that I needed government bureaucrats to be our servants. "These poor, illiterate boys aren't good enough for you." He laughed when I gave the bowed, unwashed heads a lecture on cleanliness. I felt that it was now time to include Tanya in my new life. Mustafa granted his reluctant permission for me to call Ains in Karachi to ask him to send our daughter to me, as he had promised. Mustafa stood over me as I dialed, clearly agitated by this reminder of my previous involvement with another man. The conversation was curt and devastating. Ains had heard the rumors of Mustafa's alleged infanticide, and he proclaimed that his daughter would not be allowed to live with such an evil man. Henceforth, he said, I would have no contact with Tanya. He hung up on me. I turned to Mustafa for solace. "He won't give her to me," I wailed. But Mustafa's expression silenced me. His eyes said, "I have granted you this tremendous privilege to ring up your former husband. Now, be done with it. I am the important one in your life, not Tanya." There was no sleep for me that night. I knew that Tanya's school was reopening the next morning, and I was plagued by dark visions of her motherless existence. Who would dress my baby? Who would prepare her lunch? In the morning, Mustafa found me crying. "If you loved your daughter so much, why did you marry me?" he asked. "You should have known the consequences of your action. You can't ruin my life now by crying for Tanya. You have no business crying for her. I never want to see you crying for her again. Never ever. Do you hear?" I glanced up sharply and recoiled at the sight of his face. Anger, bitterness and menace were combined in one terrifying expression. Soon after that, I learned that I was pregnant. Mustafa insisted that I start my day by consuming buttered parathas and eggs. He ordered me to eat all of this and to wash it down with a 16 fluid ounces glass of fresh cow's milk. I was to drink yet another glass of the creamy beverage in the evening, which always left me nauseous. Mustafa claimed that the regimen was nutritious for the unborn child. The rich food left me bloated and uncomfortable, and I came to believe that he forced it into me to ensure that I became fat, to assure my unattractiveness to other men. Aisha was assigned the task of serving the milk, morning and evening, and making sure that I drained the glass. One evening Mustafa came into the bedroom and asked if I had drunk my milk. I had not. He immediately summoned Di and railed at the frightened woman. "Why has she not had her milk?" Di mumbled an explanation. I had not asked for it. She had forgotten to bring it. Mustafa thrust his foot squarely against Di's backside, sending her flying through the doorway. The awareness that had been growing slowly now blossomed into full and ghastly flower. I had fallen into the classic trap of the Pakistani woman. The goal is marriage and, once achieved, the future is a life of total subordination. I had no power, no rights, no will of my own. Early in 1977, after Mustafa and I had been married for little more than half a year, Bhutto called for elections, pitting the People's Party against a patchwork coalition of program made the US nervous. America was 9 opposition parties calling themselves the Pakistan National Alliance. Mustafa and I left, for a month-long vacation, in London so that he could avoid a political confrontation with his estranged friend. The People's Party won a large majority, but the opposition refused to accept the results, claiming that Bhutto's henchmen had resorted to large-scale rigging and ballot-stuffing tactics. Mobs took their anger to the streets. A plague of strikes and violence disrupted the country's economy. There was mounting chaos in all the major cities. Pakistan was on the brink of self-destruction. The opposition leaders smelled a popular victory, and perhaps found a strong ally. Bhutto's independent foreign policy and his pursuit of a controversial nuclear, afraid that the so-called Islamic bomb would find its way into the hands of countries like Libya and Syria, not to mention terrorist organizations. Rumor held that opposition to Bhutto was fueled by US dollars. The opposition also knew that Pakistan's military leaders were waiting in the wings. They feared that a nuclear capability would result in massive cuts in conventional forces, thus eroding their personal power. Events snowballed. The strikes and demonstrations became so severe that in 3 large cities Bhutto had to call out the army. Mustafa and I returned from London to find Bhutto struggling for political survival. The Prime Minister knew that he had to win back the allegiance of the Punjab, and the only man who could do that for him was Mustafa Khar. Bhutto swallowed a considerable amount of pride and invited Mustafa to Islamabad and back into the People's Party fold.